Okay, good morning, everybody. I believe that we can start. Welcome to the third and final day of our 2025 virtual symposium of the Society for the Study of Pregnancy and Birth. My name is Dr. Anna Hennessy, and I am the founder and director of the Society. We've had 2 wonderful days. Okay, so I am going to hand it over. So we have session 8, which is philosophical approaches to birth, natality, and maternal identity. And our wonderful moderator is Dr. Beatrice Sasha Kobow from the University of Salzburg. So Beatrice, I'm now turning it over to you. So thank you so much.
Yes, Anna and everybody, good morning and welcome to this exciting third day. I must say that it's one of the most riveting conferences I've ever been part of and I've ever attended. And I feel that the care and appropriateness with which the papers have also been put into these individual sessions is truly satisfying. And so I cannot wait to hear the papers in my session 8. And with that, I will introduce our first presenter, Dr. Barbara Renzi. She works currently in Berlin at the Berlin School of Business and Innovation. She holds 2 PhDs, one from the Queen's University in Belfast and one from Roma Tre. She works such exciting work. I won't keep you very long. It's on psychology, feminism, and environmental concerns. She is a psychologist and philosopher. And today, I believe she will talk about feminist resistance. And yes, Barbara, I'm excited.
Thank you so much. I'm excited too. I'm going to share my presentation that it's a bit too long because it's a paper, but I'm going to skip some part, okay? So I'm sharing the screen and so this is the title of the presentation. I'm going to speak about the Cavarero framework, but I will try to modify it and maybe enhance it, thinking about phenomenological intergenerational perspectives applied to maternity. So this paper is the result not just of my research, but of my giving birth and trying to understand what was going on with me more than 16 years ago. So a long time. It's a long time paper. So the first point that I want to make is that we have to speak about relational vulnerability. So, we are just not here alone. So we're going to speak about logically vulnerability and especially the concept that, we are not isolated, autonomous individuals. We are here, we are what we are because we are connected with the other. And why we're focusing on maternal identity? Because, it's maybe combine physical and emotional, ethical dimension of human connection, and it might be vulnerability in action, especially in particular situations. So why Adriana Cavarero, who is an Italian philosopher feminist? Because I think that she underlined the concept of vulnerability. She especially underlined the concept of interconnectedness from a philosophical perspective, which I think is very important. But I think we can do we can go from a multi-dimensional understanding of relational identity. Let's see if I can move. Yes. So the philosophy of vulnerability. Okay. So we are formed, and this is not just philosophy, a feminist philosophy. We have all tradition in psychology, so we are very important. We are formed through the exposure to the others. Okay. So we are not shaped in isolation, but we are through the interaction relationship with others. And I think the notion of I, if you think about psychoanalysis, they say it's quite new thing. So vulnerability is intrinsic to subjectivity, and it's not a weakness. Although we think that the word vulnerability brings inside self weakness, is not like that. You know, it's who we are, okay, and it's openness. Like maternity is openness. The individual is not autonomous, although Western philosophy, you know, glorify the self-sufficiency. We are much more than that. You know, we are interdependent and connected, and not just among human beings, but you know, we always say the nature and us. No, we are all together, and we forget that. So there is an ethical and political dimension inside it. The vulnerability has a significant moral and civic implication. It demands systems and structures that prioritize care and interrelations. And so maternal body is an ethical site of care because mother embodies a form of non-violent generative vulnerability. Her body demonstrates the ethical power giving and sustaining life. So we contrast that with the Cavarero concept of horrorism, violence attack on vulnerability. Horrorism exposes and exploits the very condition that make us human. It weaponizes vulnerability, especially of those least able to defend themselves in particular situations. Motherhood as a paradigm of non-violent rationality. Maternity reflects a vulnerability not as a lack, but as an ethical resource. It shows how we deep relational bonds can ground moral and social life. Okay, so I will not sorry. So horrorism, I'm not going to speak about horrorism because if you want to come back here, because I'm pretty sure that you know these questions, I'll just skip them. But if you want, we can go back later on if you have questions. So inclination, according to Cavarero, as a metaphor for ethical openness, it suggests this posture of leaning towards. So human body is inclined towards the other, okay? And maternity has lived inclination. Motherhood enacts the ethical orientation Cavarero describes. The mother is literally turned towards the other in care. So, and we know that, you know, other philosophers have spoken about it. And, you know, we know that motherhood both empowers and alienates. I'm not going to deny that. I just wanted to underline something that we forget about motherhood sometimes. And we know also that, you know, women lived between freedom and they imposed biological roles. So this is okay, just there. And we know about Merleau-Ponty as well. The fact that the pregnancy exemplified the body, according to me, the body relational openness and fluidity. And we know everything that, as Marion Young said, that, you know, pregnancy is a site of dual subjectivity and contested political meaning. So I'm not going to deny that. And actually, I think we can all put together in order to see Cavarero point of view in a more, in a different way. Okay, not better, but different. Okay. So, and I'm not going to deny the tension between freedom, biological destiny. Sometimes I'm not going to deny pregnancy as a national possibility for sure. And logically, it's not the place to discuss here motherhood imposed versus freely chosen. Okay, so but it's important that we don't forget the embodiment as an openness and the self and other in pregnancy together. The fetus is simultaneously part and separate from the mother, and this blurs the boundaries and creates an intersubjectivity bodily state. Identities share shape through bodily coexistence. The mother becomes a locus for simultaneous subjectivities. You know, pregnancy is a two-in-one subjectivity, split embodiment, ethical openness in many ways, and logically we have to do a critique of medicalization and objectification, okay? Reclaiming our maternal agency and experience. So I'm going to split that because sorry, I'm going to to go. We can go there, you know. But just what I wanted to. If you want, we can go back on the slides for possible question. I've done more for this reason. But, you know, pregnancy and care ethics. So traditional ethics like Kant of utilitarianism often ignore the embody-dependent relational life. But pregnancy demands a non-abstract ethic of care, attention, nourishment, and waiting. A rethinking of power, not dominance, but mutual dependence and vulnerability. And I like that personally. So pregnancy is not just a biological state, it's more for me. It's a philosophical and ethical event that reveal how the body is not whole and closed, the self is not solitary, ethics begins in relation, not rules. So there are lots of temporary waiting, anticipation, and becoming. Maternity is experienced through future-oriented time. Pregnancy reshaped time in different rhythm, anticipation, transformation. And care emerges from live bodily encounters with dependent other. The care is not optional, but is intrinsic to maternal experience. Maternal subjectivity can be seen as transformative. Motherhood redefines selfhood through vulnerability and connection. It alters the identity by fostering ongoing openness to others. So I would like to speak about intergenerational perspective because apart from the body, we are also open to the past. We are not just who we are now. We are our mother, the mother of our mothers, and this is pretty much clear in psychoanalysis. So there is identity to genealogy and memory. Identity shaped through lines of maternal descendant. This relational history form how one understands the role as a mother. Not just that, also the roles of the society, the people who are there, the nurses that you meet. Storytelling transmission is very much important because cultural memory and identity pass through maternal narratives. Stories offer emotional framework, also inherited values, and just not just the word, but also the word of not said. Okay, so imagine also the relationship. Yeah, you know, your first child die. Some people still die after birth, during birth, and the first child comes after that. There are lots of psychoanalytical papers that is sometimes if the trauma is not totally overcome, it's a substitute child. So the relationship is complicated, not just from what happened through genealogy and memory, but what happened in our life, you know, in our relationship with what is not, but with what we thought it was going to be. So we don't have to forget the ethical and political relevance of the lineage of our mother and mothers, because this challenge individualistic model of self with generational continuity, suggesting that ethic is rooted in the care rather than in the dependence. And, you know, if we just give a look at Yulia Kristeva, early maternal bonds shape symbolic identity. The core reflects the affective roots of communication and meeting. Intergenerational melancholic and silence is there. Trauma and identity are often passed in a spoken way. Emotional inheritance occurs outside of direct language. Maternal identity is shaped by inheriting codes, which means language and emotion are passed down unconsciously. Cultural scripts influence maternal roles without explicit awareness. So logically, there is the idea of post-memory inherited trauma there, and maternal genealogies, where maternal narrative structure personal and collective identities, and memories narrating and ethical responsible ways, in the sense that we, a new generation, carry weight of past trauma, so engaging post memory, and this is started with the relationship. I'm just going to skip those, and because I'm going to to go to the political implication, and because I've done slides for possible questions. Okay, so the political implications are there. So we should challenge autonomy-centered politics. Policy must consist care and dependency. It should be politics of care. Care should be the most important word. Maternity exposes the limits of liberal individualism. Supporting caregiving roles is extremely important. Valuing unpaid maternal labor, societal contribution, recognizing care work as essential to social sustainability. Social justice is through care-based models. So we should redesign a system to support vulnerable population. Policy must reflect the rational nature of human life. I mean, life is relational, not human life. Life is relational. Here, I show from current slide. So vulnerability is not just a risk, it's creative and ethical. Without vulnerability, we don't have creativity. Maternity reveals how vulnerability produces new forms of lives and meanings in many ways. Identity emerges through body, story, and memory. This dimension expand the philosophical model that Cavarero gave us. Selfhood is formed through dynamic relationship, and it's psychologists, not just philosophy. So maternity, what does it exemplify? It simplify identity as an unfolding process. I don't know how long I have, and I want to skip this because I already spoke about ethical as refraining. Sorry, I'm just going here. So I show from current slide. So we have spoken about the importance of relational identity, the vulnerability and exposure. Okay, so we are what we are. We forget that we are dependent. Ethics of care openness. So motherhood is a relational identity, already spoken, and the philosophical implication demonstrate what they show that identity is never purely individual. So we've seen that it's formed in and through relationship. So ethics should be. So the maternal body is open, exposed, vulnerable to others' needs. The ethical implication here that the motherhood demands recognizing vulnerability as a strength and ethical responsibility rather than weakness. Maternal relationships require an ethics rooted in openness and care, not moral abstract rule. Ethics is not chosen, but raises naturally and in a necessary way out of bodily and relational exposure to another life. Motherhood simplifies the idea that ethical responsibility is not something added on top of relationship, but rather something emerging directly from them. So, so motherhood becomes a radical ethical position for broader social responsibility and care ethics in society. The social ethical dimension of motherhood as practice is not just mere biology, it's much more. So, and we have lots of examples in life. Motherhood through crisis, community mothering, motherhood has resistance, mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, women who mother children collectively, refugee mother protecting children. Why does expansion matter? Because motherhood reveals that the motherhood is not just a private act, but philosophical, ethical, even political one. It calls for a new ethical paradigm based on relationality, vulnerability, and care. Motherhood is the lived embodiment of relationship ethical openness, and bodily vulnerability. Thus, it demands a societal and philosophical reorientation toward ethics as a relational care. So, motherhood is an intergenerational embodiment. And because we carry embodied memory and inherited practice from previous generation. We practice care, nurturing, her hand it down. We shape mothers and their children. And maternal ethics extend beyond immediate care to responsibility towards future. Motherhood demands ethical decisions that affect not only the present, but the sustainability of life and well-being for future generations. We know that intergenerational trauma and healing is passed on, but also the healing, the love is passed on, not just the trauma, and we forget about that. International motherhood shows relational identity extending across time, connecting past, present, future, and ethical continuity of rupture. So mothers, also in the extended meaning, become critical actors. In either we can perpetuate cycle of trauma or initiate transformative relational care. So logically, we have family and community as co-mothering, social institutional relationships, are important for healthcare, education, social support, and employment. And we have what I call it is ecological, ecological relationality. So a relationship in an ecological way. So motherhood points towards a relational interdependence, not only with humans, but also with the natural environment. We are natural environment. I say with, but we should find another word because we are nature, revealing human vulnerability to ecological system, sustainability, and environmental justice. So we need ethical framework. They are different, for sure. So we can integrate intergenerational relational networks. So how? So this is a sort of a schema because I got lost while writing this. We have intergenerational, we have to add these ideas to Cavarero. So temporal relationality, vulnerability, trauma healing together, and we have practical ethical outcomes. We can have broader network because logically we need community, society, and ecology. Mother needs community. They cannot do on their own, and we have to have supportive system, environmental care. And there are maternal and digital movement, community mother as an immigrant network, and actually it's difficult, but sometimes they work. Sometimes environmental justice, maternal activism. That's what I say. There are different movements. I'm not going to speak them. So yes, we should expand the Cavarero philosophy of relational identity, ethical openness, embody vulnerability towards motherhood, intergenerational and broader relation dimension. And we see clearly that motherhood is relational. I'm saying it demands an ethical framework, and logically phenomenology help us because we emphasize on lived experience. So we just have to say the self, not just how it is narrated, but the sense through the body, perception, emotion in the world. We should work on, I don't see the slide, sorry. We should work on embodied intersubjectivity. The self is not just told, but co-emerge, and we don't have to forget that. And it's very difficult to become mothers. It's not just a biological act. And yes, so this corporal intersubjectivity shows how identity is shaped by affective encounter, gesture, spatiality, and presence. And I'm telling you, it's very difficult to give birth in a different country that is not yours, with a different language. It's not a joke. And we have temporality and becoming. Yes, it's there, It's not just lived through time with anticipation, memory, and presence. Temporality is not lived, rather it's lived not just in a chronological way. We have to explore them constantly, how we become through past, present, future horizon. And yes, so Cavarero gives centrality to the voice, but it's not just a voice. It's more that, the act of the voice oneself is just a narrative act, but it's an experiential, embodied, affective one. That's what I say, So we should really expand that. allow us to attend not only the narrative who, but the felt, embodied, and lived how. And there are two different things. So we have written sensation and affective dimension through which the identity is constituted in lived encountered. So, and here it's just a sort of, you know, repeating as a conclusion, you know, so the felt textual motherhood are extremely important as well. And the relationality and intersubjectivity, you know, because it's really a radical intersubjective entanglement, body intertwined. Yes, so I'm pretty sure that you agree with that. And yeah, that's it. I think just it's you know, analyze how mother lives in a dual temporality, her own narrative and the child unfolding life interwoven, shaping herself, and how mother voice, attunement, participate, shape both her own and the child emerging identity. So phenomenological lens are extremely important. I'm not going to read that because it's sort of a repetition and the conclusion, you know, I think I was strong on the importance of political change, that ethics should start from relationship, and, you know, and so maternal identity reveals depth of relational vulnerability. Maternity provides tangible evidence of our shared human condition. We always forget about that. It's always the I. And, you know, this approach illuminates the full spectrum of relational life, you know, phenomenology, international theory that we can adopt, the Cavarero. And we need a more human relational understanding of ethics and our identity. So we have to reframe vulnerability as a strength because it's not openness, so it's creativity. And, you know, a call for ethics that prioritize care, mutuality, and connection, and not rules. These are the rules. And I stopped the thing, and I hope you really enjoyed.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It was brilliant. I think I agree with everything you said. It was lovely. I think we'll have time to discuss at the end of our session. I would like to give the word over to Sarah Runnstrom now. Sarah, I'm excited to hear Sarah's paper, which has the title Birth as a Vital Existential Condition in the Philosophy of Hannah Arendt and Paul Ricoeur. Sarah has a BA in Philosophy and Film Studies from the University of Glasgow and a Master's in Religion from Lund University. She just finished an interfaith studies program in Japan, where she had opportunity to further her research interests in existential theology, hermeneutics, and embodiment and hope. So I'm very excited, Sarah, to hear your paper. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you so much to all the organizers of this symposium. It's been really fascinating to take part, and I'm impressed of the wonderful perspectives that have been brought together on so many different topics. So thank you for that. Let me just share my screen here. All right. So I'll be presenting on birth as a vital existential concept in the work of Hannah Arendt and Paul Ricoeur. The aim of this presentation is to contribute to the growing reflection on birth within contemporary existential thought. By attending to Arendt's concept of natality, the condition of having been born, and the phenomenological and hermeneutic treatment of birth in Ricoeur's work, I propose that we can uncover birth as a vital existential ground for hope. More specifically, I argue that birth, as representing both a site for novelty and embodied interrelation, invites a rethinking and re-narrating of identity and responsibility. This reconception holds ethical implications and possibilities. I'll begin by examining Ricoeur's critique of death-focused existentialism, his interaction with the concept of birth, and its relation to his notions of embodiment and narrative identity. This will be followed by a dive into Arendt's political reframing of birth as the ground of action and novelty. Through drawing on their shared, though distinct perspectives, I aim to demonstrate how birth can be reclaimed as a creative and hopeful horizon for existential and ethical thought. So let us begin with Ricoeur. Ricoeur challenges the centrality of death in existential thought. So while he's influenced by Heidegger's being in time, Ricoeur critiques Heidegger's view that authenticity is achieved through a solitary confrontation with one's own finitude. He attempts to reorientate this inward turn in Heidegger, which he considers to withdraw from the social, from history, and from embodied life. Ricoeur, in contrast, grounds the anguish of death in our relational and interdependent existence. In his essay, True and False Anguish, he introduces death as a vital anguish, a form of anxiety not born out of an abstract anticipation of one's own end, but from a profound desire to live in the world with others. The primary encounter with death for Ricoeur is the actual lived experience of the death of the other. The death of the other is not only a future possibility to be reckoned with, but a concrete, emotionally charged event that wounds the self and reveals both the fragility and interdependence of human existence. This shift is crucial because our fear of death is not comprehended in existential isolation for Ricoeur, but it entails the loss of the world and the loss of the other, which means that knowledge of our own finitude becomes meaningful within the context of this relational world. In this way, Ricoeur reframes the existential confrontation with death is not only a confrontation with nothingness, but the breakdown of relationality. This reorientation supports a consideration of birth, not as a passive biological beginning, but as a lived, embodied presence shared with others. If death wounds our relational bonds, then birth for Ricoeur becomes the original site, the original and continuous site of those bonds. In Fallible Man and the Symbolism of Evil, Ricoeur reflects on the existential implications of birth as a pre-reflective grounding of selfhood and agency. Birth is the origin of our openness to the world, our capacity to reflect, and our being in relation. He claims that prior to identifying ourselves as distinct to others, as individual or isolated beings, our carnal presence in the world is characterized by an initial openness that is deeply entangled with the world, and which is then subsequently redefined as the boundaries of our own finite existence are set. According to Ricoeur, a meditation on birth can reconnect us to an initial or pre-reflective openness. And through more deeply recognizing the relational and embodied web that we are entangled within, there emerges a possibility to widen the scope of our isolated sense of identity. We can then challenge the strict boundary between self and other and self and world. Ricoeur argues that birth in this way reveals a primordial yes to existence, an openness and hence an affirmation of life that precedes reflection. This yes represents a widening of the self, a movement beyond the boundaries of isolation. Where Heidegger's being towards death directs the self inward, Ricoeur's meditation on birth turns the self outwards, towards the relational and the embodied. It represents in this way a joyful recognition of a love for life. Through this lens, identity is not a static essence, but constantly unfolding in response to the world and with others. as well as in relation to our own memories, experiences, and personal histories. Through a deeper meditation on birth, we can reimagine our identities and expand their narrative borders to incorporate a deeper sense of relational dependence on others, and also an increased gratitude towards existence. This in turn opens up for new modes of responsibility and ethical action. While Ricoeur's emphasis lies on subjectivity and narrative expansion of self when it comes to birth, Arendt turns to the public and political dimensions of existence in her engagement with birth. In The Human Condition, she positions natality, not mortality, as central to human existence. Natality is not merely the fact of being born, but the capacity to begin, to introduce something new into the world. For Arendt, every birth is a break in the history of life, an interruption of what already exists. What is key, however, is that this interruption does not happen in isolation. Natality is always exercised within a shared world, among others, and within a web of pre-existing relationships and histories. So while natality signifies a possibility for novelty and spontaneity, it is not one that is purely self-originating. It is one situated within a condition of coexistence. This, I think, is a crucial point in Arendt's thought that deepens our understanding of the existential possibilities of birth. It shows that novelty is possible, but it does not emerge from a void. It emerges from within a co-inhabited world. It is precisely because we are engaged in histories, institutions, languages, and relationships that our capacity to begin anew has significance. Arendt's concept of natality therefore brings to light a form of novelty that emerges within a plural world that is both fragile and transformative. Arendt also highlights, like Ricoeur, that our actions allow for our identity to be narrated. However, she is more specifically considers the reception of our actions by others in the public sphere as determining the stories of our lives, the way our actions are witnessed through the eyes of spectators. In Ricoeur's hermeneutics, this interdependence is embodied and informs our narrative self-identities, both from a personal and an outward-looking perspective. In Arendt's political thought, it's our impact on the world, perceived through the eyes of others, that becomes a central narrative focus. Arendt has, of course, been critiqued for this externally focused account of narrative action, and scholars such as Judith Butler, Adrienne Rich, and Wendy Brown have argued that Arendt's privileging of spontaneous visible acts in the public realm can exclude perspectives of the marginalized, silenced, or structurally disempowered. One reason for this is that an external spectorial standpoint cannot adequately account for the complexities and intricacies of life, which are deeply embodied, relational, and often shaped by invisible forms of suffering. In this sense, plurality can function to override the uniqueness rather than complement it, through overshadowing certain voices and negating rather than affirming their uniqueness. In contrast, Ricoeur's emphasis on interpretive process as subjective and mediated through lived experience can offer a more inclusive and dynamic framework by granting more power to subjective authorship as informed by memory, trauma, and marginality. Through grounding the self in a historically situated embodiedness, he can accommodate for a broader range of voices and experiences, especially those excluded from the political stage. His phenomenological approach hence reshapes the relationship between narrative and action, enabling a deeper engagement with the personal, ethical, and historical dimensions of how individuals and communities make sense of their own past. In this way, Ricoeur more deeply affirms uniqueness than Arendt does. Despite this, I do not believe that Ricoeur's view should replace Arendt's. Rather, it can expand and deepen her conception of the uniqueness of each person. This collaboration offers a more contextualized understanding of the various frameworks through which novelty and political action can emerge. This complements, of course, the work of scholars like Cavarero, who have taken Arendt in a similar direction. And as the work of Dr. Barbara Renzi just beautifully and eloquently explained. So at this point, I would like to suggest that Ricoeur and Arendt together offer a powerful existential orientation. Instead of confronting the self with death in isolation, they both direct attention to the interdependence of life. In both cases, an emphasis on birth provides an alternative to the individualistic and often isolating tone of death-focused existentialism. Birth highlights not only our dependence on others, but our capacity to transform that dependence into solidarity, responsibility, and ethical action. So by bringing together Arendt and Ricoeur, we can therefore take a bigger step towards static accounts of identity or agency, and towards a deeper understanding of the self that is centered around interdependence and also imaginative renewal, while comprehending also the many structural and embodied complexities and inequalities that must frame such a renewal. While there are, of course, distinctions in their philosophical aims and focus, their convergence with regard to birth open space for a hopeful vision of political and personal transformation, one where the capacity to begin again is rooted not in autonomy, but in personal and historically, personal and historically and socially situated, and open to otherness and the ongoing creative possibilities of human life. One that through Ricoeur is grounded also in an affirmation of life, a yes to life rather than its negation. The hope which emerges from this view is not escapist. It doesn't reject finitude, and it doesn't project a utopian vision. Rather, it is a way of inhabiting limitation with a kind of grounded and careful optimism and perhaps joy, located in the belief that something new can emerge precisely because we are not isolated, because we are connected and embedded. So thinkers like Judith Butler and Adriana Cavarero have already built upon Arendt's insights to explore how relationality forms a ethical core of political life. Integrating into Ricoeur into this framework not only strengthens Arendt's political vision, but also resonates with and builds upon the work of these scholars, who similarly critique solitary models of subjectivity in favor of a more relational ontology rooted in natality and vulnerability. It should also be noted that Ricoeur's philosophical hermeneutics has been extended by scholars like Bernard Dauenhauer, Richard Kearney, and Jean-Luc Almary, who emphasize the ethical implications of narrative refiguration and the embodied extended nature of selfhood, exploring how this also leads to a deeper affirmation of life. By drawing Arendt into this perspective, the ethical orientation of Ricoeur's work can be further expanded towards possibilities for a more radical novelty to emerge within the embodied, shared, and interrelated world, which offers also a deeper comprehension of the complexities of uniqueness. So existential thought has long taught us to look to death as the ultimate horizon of meaning, but I think that to think from birth is to think relationally and creatively, and also with love and hope. It is to recognize that our dependence stretches beyond the boundaries of ourself, and to affirm that while life is finite, limitations can open to further potentials. What this shows is that the self is not sovereign, but a being shaped in and through the world, and that this world can be changed through our actions. As Arendt reminds us, without the fact of birth, we would not even know what novelty is. So in this presentation, I have drawn on the work of Arendt and Ricoeur to argue that birth as an existential concept emphasizes the inherently relational nature of being, one that precedes and informs the anguish of death. Through Ricoeur, I suggested that by engaging with the concept of birth, we can deepen our understanding of relational life and explore how our identities are shaped in connection with others. This reframes the self as fundamentally dependent on others, thereby offering a heightened sense of responsibility. It also reveals how our self-narratives emerge through our relation to the world, grounded in our embodied and contextual existence. And it opens for a deeper affirmation of life through such uniqueness. While Arendt's concept of natality brings forth a powerful view of new beginnings rooted in plurality, Ricoeur situates identity and action within an interpretative embodied process that includes memory, trauma, and marginality. His view does not replace Arendt's, but it exposes its silences and deepens its existential implications, revealing how novelty might also emerge from hidden, wounded, or relational sites of meaning-making. On the other hand, Arendt's political existentialism further underscores how these complexities can culminate in novelty and a form of transformative action and meaningful change. However, this perspective of both Arendt and Ricoeur needs to be applied more to concrete, real scenarios for its possibilities and limitations to be tested. And I think Dr. Renzi gave a perfect example of what that could look like in her treatment of motherhood and the maternal narrative. But through the shared insights of Arendt and Ricoeur, we are invited to reimagine birth, not death, as a central existential focus of human life. This reorientation offers an integration between Ricoeur's embodied yes to life and Arendt's emphasis on natality and novelty. Together, their perspectives open new pathways for meaning, action, and hope.
Lovely. Many thanks, Sarah. Wonderful, interesting perspective on what I so appreciate about your paper is that I think it's really thinking sources together that is going to bring us forward. So many thanks. We'll have questions at the end. And therefore, I think I will continue with my own presentation. My name is Beatrice Kobow. I'm going to try to share my slides with you. Okay, so here is a little encounter I had with ChatGPT. I asked it to generate an image which conveys the meaning of motherhood and birth because I wanted to put an image on my first slide. The title of my talk is Natality as the Meaning of Meaning, Notes on Birth and Meaning. And so instead of getting an image, ChatGPT said to me, I wasn't able to generate the image because this request violates our content policies. If you'd like, you can provide a new prompt and I'll be happy to create an image that aligns with the guidelines. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. And of course, I looked up the content policies and guidelines, and I also corresponded and conversed a little bit more with ChatGPT, but I won't go into that now. My talk is going to really bridge this question of how meaning can remain permanent, how meaning can be generated, and very much in line with the last two speakers on who's the things that they said I really can build. I think that it is in the idea of natality, both in being born and being mothering, not only in a biological but also in an extended understanding, meaning can be maintained. And though I didn't receive a ChatGPT image, I decided to show you an image of myself when our second youngest son was just born. And I wanted to show, so my children thought it was a very, very embarrassing picture. And I thought for a while whether I should include it, but then I decided to include it because I think it really expresses what I wanted to say, that the birth is something that is a very individualized thing. And this is the second focus of my talk, is that I think we actually need this focus on the individual, yet we also need the focus on the embeddedness and situatedness of the individual in this community of meaning making. And so let me go on. I think that I have thought about having two goals with my talk today. One was on some sort of self-meditation on what kind of discipline we are working in. It's a collective disciplinary self-meditation. I often ask myself as a philosopher, what is it that philosophers do, and is it even justified given all this feminist uneasiness with its focus on death and its denial of the feminine? Can we even go on being philosophers? And so this is my first question. What is social ontology? And I think that these, all these studies on natality and maternity could be said to maybe be part of social ontology. So what is social ontology and what do we want it to be? Of course, this refers to the title by Sally Haslanger, Race and Gender. What are they? What do we want them to be? And I think we need to ask that also of the discipline that we're working in, to work on the frame. And then I would like to try my hand at a substantive argument. And here is my thesis, or the thing that I want to defend, is that natality guarantees meaning permanence. And this is how I'm going to attempt it. So for the self-meditation, I'm going to revisit Anna Hennessy's excellent book, Imagery, Ritual, and Birth, Ontology Between the Sacred and the Secular, because it is in this encounter with Anna's work that I really started to think about the implications of birth for social ontology. And for the argument, I would like to start working towards saying that meaning depends on individuality. Initium is Arendt's word, and intergenerational transmission of meaning, namely canon. Another way of understanding the canon and rereading the canon. So ultimately, we should be able to say that social ontology works on meaning theories that are for and open to the future. So this is the two aims of my talk. I have worked a little bit, begun to work on this in a very recent publication. This is a monograph entitled Permanence of Meaning, Bedeutungspermanenz, and it came out last November. And this book project really started 5 years ago in this seminar that I taught with students on the question of whose lives matter. It was a seminar I taught at Salzburg, and I had fantastic students, and it was a very wonderful seminar. And it asked this question, whose lives matter, in terms of real world concerns that the students had, but also as a disciplinary investigation. And so in this, I came to then propose, after working on this for a while, I wanted to say that meaning is, so I'm a language philosopher from my training and from my inclinations, but I wanted to start with this feminist question. I think this is a feminist question, whose lives matter. And also the question, of course, who gets to be born at all is another part of this question. But I wanted to say that meaning is relational and processual, and that has some positions that it is against, namely philosophies of angst, which are obsessed with the fear of death and the strive for immortality. Some aspect of transhumanism. If transhumanism says, let's design evolution to achieve a non-finite, non-biological existence, I think that that argues for anti-natality, because the wish to live forever denies life and meaning, I want to say. And it is also posed against theories of meaning that conceive of meaning as a static thing, that frees meaning as a momentary instrumentalized reference, and also place it in this very means and irrational framework. So I do think that we need to ultimately rethink our concept of agency. I instead want to try to develop a take or a theory, or work towards a theory that says that life as a process of relating is meaningful, and in this sense it is also good for us. What does it mean? The participation in real and future communities of speakers constitutes a moral obligation. Now you might think, oh, that's very Kantian, moral obligation. It might not be such a nice thing, but no, I think it is, because this obligation is, I think, the space. It is like a space in which we can flourish and bring out our potential to fruition. So that is eudaimonia. I think this is a, here I think Arendt's very important, because she thinks that it's a space in which we can appear, and I think meaning making is this space. So I also want to refer back to Adriana Cavarero. This is her latest book. It's from 23, I believe, yes, where she talks about icons of hyper-maternity. And she talks about Simone de Beauvoir here, and I want to read this quote if I can. Spica fra questi temi, il tema della maternità trattato da Beauvoir in termini decisamente negativi, quasi una maledizione naturale, dalla quale la donna dovrebbe affrancarsi. Also, prominent among these themes is the theme of motherhood, treated by Beauvoir in decidedly negative terms, almost a natural curse from which woman should free herself. According, now, second part of the quote, according to the philosopher's existentialist perspective, humankind is indeed characterized by the capacity to transcend its animal condition, that is, to realize itself as a singular existence endowed with consciousness and freedom. So here we have a worry that maternity, or maybe the being identified too much with nature and not with reason, as we saw in the brilliant first presentation, to give capacity back to the process of giving birth. Here is the worry that Beauvoir has, that being a mother is some form of biological determinism. So I think strikingly, this also is a worry that language philosophers have. For example, Max Stirner in 1844 wrote a book that was called Der Einzige und sein Eigentum, the unique one and his property, in which I think the upshot is that he says, well, fixed meanings could hamper my ability to begin anew. And beginning anew is, of course, what Hannah Arendt talks about. I think that we see this worry in Beauvoir and maybe in Stirner, that meaning, but also relationality in some way could fix us beyond the ability to be free, or beyond the ability to conceive of our existence freely, and that the one capacity that humans have was to transcend this, this nature. Now I'd like to turn to Anna's book and read a little bit from a review that I wrote of it. In Imagery, Ritual, and Birth, Ontology between the Sacred and the Secular, Anna Hennessy explores how objects shift in their ontology according to how we regard them. They can shift from being sacred to being object used for pragmatic purposes in a secular context, and then being restored to a sacred status according to the existential meaning they acquired as objects used in a rite of passage. She approaches this topic by analyzing images and objects used to assist childbirth. Thus, the book contributes to different discourses. It advances aspects of feminism, art history, and philosophy of religion, while making a fundamental contribution to the field of social ontology. And as someone working in social ontology, this was the most amazing thing for me in engaging with this work, to see just that, how social ontology could be transformed. Let me go on a little bit more. I think what Anna does so convincingly is that she gives a critique on a particular analytic discussion of mental representation. Imagery, Ritual, and Birth presents a critique on the academic discussion of mental representation underlying analytic social ontology. The book is as much about images and rituals of birth as it is about ontology itself. Indeed, understanding the sacred dimension of birth is transforming social ontology in an ontological sense. If the ontology of objects is shifting because we are imposing a status on these objects, then this ontology is entirely up to us. It is constantly transforming. And if we think that reality is mind-dependent, then what we take these objects to be will transform them and us. So I think what this amounts to is to say that the acceptance of birth is a transformation of our discourse away from death and towards natality, and that this opens up our view towards the relational and the becoming, allowing us to see the sacred in the actual biological process of birth makes us aware of ourselves as processual and relational beings. Our life is defined as much by its finitude as by its process, but mostly by its being through others. Transforming the culture of birth through a new image, a project to which Hennessy's important book contributes, is transforming our entire collective being. So I think that this is a great project and a very important one. And I would like to talk a little bit about our collective being. There is a really wonderful, excellent, interesting study that professor did in Zurich, Judith Burkhardt, and she does experiments with these marmosets, with these little primates, and she can show that cooperative breeding might explain our motivational readiness to communicate. So while grand apes, like let's say chimpanzees or orangutans, have the ability to have the mental, let's say, capability and the capacity, like a tool use capacity, to be very advanced, they really do not have the same motivational readiness to communicate that humans have. And we might ask ourselves, well, what is that? What's the difference? And the difference really lies, as the study and other studies show, in this necessity that we have to share childcare duties. So we must communicate, we must share our food, we must take up different roles, because that is how our species evolved to be ready to communicate. So meaning making is intimately tied into who we are as biological beings, and our capacity to have thought, as Nietzsche already said very negatively, that the consciousness is just a net from person to person. That is actually the gift we have to make meaning. Here we see another study. It's also relatively recent. It is from Nature from 2024, and it shows how AI models collapse when they trained on recursively generated data. What that means is that meaning will not maintain if it's just static, if it's just trained on the same meaning that already exists. If it's missing the new, it very quickly will deteriorate. So here you have 4 steps. You see an AI system trained to generate an image of a dog. Various dog images emerge. Then you have a tending towards the medium, of course. It's always tending to that median line of what's most represented. So in step 3, we have a little variation. In step 2, in step 3, we have only golden retrievers. And in step 4, it has broken down. We have no more dog shape. So here we have actively lost meaning because we didn't have this transmission to both. We didn't have these two aspects. We didn't have the new, and we didn't have the canonical. We didn't have this handing over of meaning. This is why I think not only is, like Sarah said, this horizon of meaning, being born is actually necessary for us to maintain meaning. And this is, I think, something you can also see with Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition. I thought it was interesting to give the other 2 titles. She had always thought about giving it the title Amor Mundi, Love for the World, but then decided against it. And then she also gave it a different title in the German translation, which she did herself, of course, Vita Activa, oder vom tätigen Leben. So I think these 3 aspects highlight different aspects of the work. And I won't go into it in detail. This is almost at the end of the presentation, but I wanted to say that I think what Arendt speaks against is this desire to leave the world, this ultimate Archimedean point that we want to say, leave it all behind. And I think that this desire can be felt very, very strongly if you think about all the phallic objects that are being shot into space right now. So the desire to leave the world is a negative thing, and it's counteracted with this, as we heard before, this beautiful idea of the ability to begin anew. And here we see a very young people at the European Youth Parliament. I chose this image because I think it also shows that for Arendt this is political action, and that the new people, the young people, the new generations are called to take political action. And so this is really the 2 things I wanted to talk about, that meaning depends on individuality initium and intergenerational transmission of meaning, namely canon, and that in this way, social ontology works on meaning theories for and open to the future. Thank you so much. Yeah, and since we will have questions at the end, we will come to our last presentation in the session, and that is a presentation by Hannah Lang of Aarhus University. Hello, Hannah. I'm so happy to see you. I believe you're at the Kierkegaard archives right now. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Lovely. So we will hear a talk on Søren Kierkegaard and Hannah Arendt on birth as a radical new beginning. So excited to hear it, Hannah. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'll start by sharing my screen. This here. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much. I've really been looking forward to taking part in this symposium. And it's just been really inspiring to hear all your talks. And just to tell you a bit more about my work, then I am currently doing a PhD project about birth as a topic of existential philosophy. And here I'm focusing especially on the Danish thinker, existential thinker Søren Kierkegaard, and also on Hannah Arendt and her concept of natality. So my project is very inspired by her concept of natality. And so in general, I'm very interested in also revisiting a more traditional thinker, that is Kierkegaard, in light of this new topic. Of course, birth is not new, but it is quite new in philosophy, or this growing research interest in natality and birth. And I also include or draw on contemporary literature on the experiences of birth, pregnancy, and becoming a parent or a mother in my research. And that is mostly Danish contemporary literature, which has gotten really big during the last couple of years, or the last 10 years or so. And then I also work together with some Danish researchers in midwifery studies. So even though I'm mostly in philosophy, I have a little bit of interdisciplinary in my research. But today I want to present some thoughts from my project. And before I turn my attention to Kierkegaard and talk about the moment of birth, I want to start out a quite different place than Kierkegaard. And that is, that is in this description here of the moment of birth. And the quote here, it's from the Danish author Cecilie Lind's long poem called Mit barn in Danish. It's not translated to English yet, so I did this translation. But in English, the title is My Child, and it's from 2019. And the poem, it centers around the experience of giving birth and becoming a mother. I'll just show you the book. And this passage here that I quoted, it takes us to the very moment of birth. And I'm just going to read it out loud for you. I was an open mouth for the miracle of life, my labia a couple of wrecked tongues. Then the child stood out as an utterance. That utterance I shall witness being human. So here in this description, the woman in labor is described as an open mouth for the miracle of life. And the open mouth, it is in a quite literal and also physically or bodily sense, the cervix being fully dilated for the baby to pass through. So in Danish, cervix is called livmodermund, which means like mouth of the uterus, if I was to translate it directly. So if you translate that directly, then it is quite literally an open mouth. And the labia as wrecked tongues is then to be read as the physical birth injuries. So just do something here, yeah. So yeah. Yeah, but then also if you read it a bit more like an imagery or figuratively speaking, then the description of the open mouth and the wrecked tongues, it also paints a picture of how the woman in labor is being unable to talk. So the description in that way, it marks a quite radical shift during birth, from the quite hectic atmosphere up until the time of birth, where there's contractions and gaspings, maybe even screaming and pushing, and then to complete silence here. To the seconds of silence that can feel like an eternity while you're waiting for the sound of life, until the newborn suddenly cries or suddenly stands out as a new beginning in the world. So this description of the open mouth, it also paints a picture of how the woman giving birth is left completely stunned as a new human being enters the world. So it's the almost incomprehensible experience that new life can begin, that it's even possible. And in that way, it also expresses a paradox. So the paradoxical experience of how birth is both something like long awaited through 9 months of labor, no, 9 months of pregnancy, thank God, and often also many hours of labor, and still somehow unexpected. So even though there's all this waiting, then birth or the moment that you see your child for the first time is still somehow unexpected or miraculous or surprising. As if the child didn't just come from the womb, but also kind of out of nothing, or if it came exactly from the darkness of the womb. So in many ways, birth is completely predictable and even banal, you could say. It's the predictable outcome of a pregnancy, just like every single one of us is born. And we know everything about the development from a fetus, of a fetus, from a blastocyst and to a full-term infant. And yet it is still something that can leave us speechless. So somehow knowing all of this, it does not explain away or diminish the radical new beginning that birth is. So the almost miraculous new beginning birth marks. And taking this experience as my point of departure, I want to talk a bit about how Kierkegaard can help us understand birth as a radical new beginning. And his understanding of the beginning as something radical or something ungrounded, you could also say, is perhaps most clearly articulated in the concept of anxiety from 1844, and it's written under the pseudonym Vigilius Hafniensis. Yeah, and here in this work we hear about the very central concept called the leap. In Danish it's called springet. And yeah, and it's also, this reading of Kierkegaard is also very inspired by Arendt's concept of natality. I won't go too much into it because of the time limit, but we already heard about how how the beginning, and at the beginning as something like a novelty, or also as she also writes in the human condition, that every beginning is something startling, unexpected. Or this transition from nothing to something, as she also talks about in The Life of the Mind. Yeah. So the concept of anxiety, it's a work that very much concerns how we are both a part of history or a part of the human race, but we are also, each one of us, a new beginning or an individual beginning anew. So in that way, it concerns our freedom very much, but it also concerns how life is not just a continuity, or we're not just a continuity, but life also moves in leaps where it begins anew. And this has everything to do with freedom, as I mentioned, that we're not just determined by whatever comes before or history. And this, is something that anxiety shows us for Kierkegaard. And that's very much what we hear about in the concept of anxiety. And the reason why I find Kierkegaard so interesting in relation to this topic is because, as someone also mentioned yesterday, and now I, of course, unfortunately, I don't remember who exactly, but someone mentioned how being a woman is also experiencing how you change throughout life, the many different transitions or phases in life. And here I think Kierkegaard is interesting to draw on, because he talks so much in relation to this about how life is not just something linearly or a continuity, but it also moves in leaps where everything is new suddenly. And one of the most famous descriptions of the leap is a description of the experience of standing at the edge of an abyss, looking down into the depth, and suddenly feeling dizzy, where everything suddenly changes in an instant. We hear about it's a quite famous description. Maybe you already know it. And then in the end of this whole long passage about the leap, or about the abyss, sorry, we hear Kierkegaard then writes, "Between these two moments lies the leap, which no science has explained and which no science can explain." So this whole situation of us standing at the edge of an abyss, looking down and becoming dizzy, where everything suddenly changes, is a description of the leap. And it is very much a description of how we see our own freedom, that we can, like, that we are just not determined, or life is not just a continuity, but we can begin anew also, and that's also the leap, or a new beginning, like I just mentioned that Arendt talks about this from nothing to something. And I also think that this description of the abyss is also about seeing how life is out of our control. It's also about seeing, like, as I mentioned, it's both seeing freedom, that somehow life is not determined, or that there's an abyss or the possibilities, but it's also seeing that life is fundamentally out of our control and something that also happens. Just like we hear about how, in this description, how everything suddenly changes from one moment to the next. So it's both our ability to do something, but it's also life that happens to us sometimes. And what I found to be the most interesting part of the leap is the sudden transition it marks. So the radical before and after. And as Kierkegaard says, when he talks about the leap, he says it cannot be explained logically because there's no smooth or direct transition between those two states, between the before and after. So the beginning as a leap does not happen in continuity with the past, but it marks a break with what we already know. And that is exactly why it is a leap and something qualitatively new, he also describes it as. So therefore, the beginning is something sudden and mysterious, and it changes everything from one moment to the next. And in that way, the leap gives us a Kierkegaardian concept of an ungrounded beginning, a beginning that is not just a continuity, as I said, but coming from nothing or the abyss. And just like I described birth as something that's long awaited and still somehow unexpected. So where the newborn suddenly emerges almost out of nothing or from the darkness of the womb, changing everything in an instant, as if there was a gap or a void or an abyss in between life as you know it and the new life beginning with birth. So to make this a bit more concrete, I would like to include another literary passage from the Danish author Josefine Klougard's novel. It's called Alt dette kunne du få. It's not translated to English, unfortunately, but it's from 2021. And in this novel, the protagonist, Barbara, she talks about the experience of, as a child, sensing that your parents have a longing or some dreams or desires that were never fulfilled. And this experience she describes as an experience of darkness. And that's where she writes the following that I quoted here. And I'm just gonna read it out loud. So she writes, "It's not so much as a darkness that could knock one out of the world in the future, but as a darkness before. A feeling of being thrown back into the darkness that precedes one's own existence. The fact that if the desire had been followed, then one would have never been." And then she ends it with the following, which is my favorite part, where she writes, "The cradle swings over an abyss. On both sides there is, as far as we know, infinite darkness." And just to explain by what I understand by this, so as a child, one's parents, they secure or make your entire world, and it's almost something God-given. So the experience that everything could have been different, it is to experience or to sense a darkness that threatens one's own existence. So using Kierkegaard's words, it is a leap that makes the ground beneath our feet tremble. And as the quote says, it's not so much a darkness that can knock one out of the world in the future, meaning it's not death we're talking about here, but it's a darkness from the past. It's the feeling of being thrown back into the darkness that precedes our own existence, as it says. And in that experience, one takes a step back into the darkness that precedes our birth, or the birth of one's child, which shows us how the two conditions of existence, birth and death, are closer to each other than we usually think. Because as she writes here, on both sides of the cradle, there is infinite darkness. Following this line of thinking, I think that being pregnant can then be described as a threshold experience. So an experience of standing at the edge of a new beginning, or at the edge of an abyss, that is the new beginning, where birth is the point in the future where the horizon darkens, like the abyss, where we can't see any further than this, or we can't get any further than this. So when you're pregnant, you kind of live in the shadow of this new beginning, and no matter how much you prepare yourself, like buy tiny body stockings or diapers, or redecorate your entire home like we did when we were to have our son, or even do breathing exercises every single night, you still cannot escape the abyss that is a part of the beginning. So there is, to say with Kierkegaard, no bridge, but a yawningly deep abyss between the before and after of the beginning, of a radical new beginning. And I would even say that the more you prepare yourself, then the clearer it kind of becomes that there is something you can't prepare for, or something that you cannot foresee or control. So in this way, the prospect of childbirth is an experience of stepping closer to the abyss day by day or week by week. And this abysmal experience, if you can call it that, in many ways reaches its climax during birth itself, where one physically almost and kind of existentially also come to an end in order for new life to begin. And so some concluding remarks on all of these thoughts I just presented. That so standing at the edge of an abyss for Kierkegaard, and also in this context that I'm reading him in here, is both an experience of loss somehow, that is a kind of losing the continuity of or life as you know it. So kind of life as you know it dissolves, but it's also an experience of turning towards life itself as something that suddenly happens or begin. So standing at the abyss is, as I mentioned, facing your possibilities and your freedom, but it's just as much staring into the darkness or the uncontrollable or unknown future, and seeing how life is also fundamentally out of our hands. Just like the beginning or leap for Kierkegaard is not something we can explain logically, but which suddenly happens also, changing everything from one moment to the next. And in that way, the beginning for Kierkegaard is something active at doing or at choosing, but it also has an interesting element of something more passive, something we also receive. So the point with all of this is not to say that birth is something dark or anxious instead of joyful, but to show how the abyss is a part of the beginning, how it is in the transitions of life, at the edge of a new beginning, that we lose the ground beneath our feet and where we encounter life as something out of our control. And now I should probably end my presentation. But just to return shortly to the quote I started with, I think that this open mouth here also reflects some of the more passive element. Of course, she's the woman giving birth, which is very active, but she's also at the same time receiving a new life as something more than she is, or that she already, as something different from what she already knows, as something that happens or something she welcomes. That was what I had in this presentation.
Thank you. That was lovely. I have to say that I am happy to be a philosopher today, with all the lovely and amazing, interesting and inspiring thoughts to present it to us. I think we will go into the Q&A. We have an ample time, more than 15 minutes, and I am going to read the questions in the Q&A, and maybe if there are some in the chat also. So the people who are not on our panel cannot see these questions, but I will read them. So Lois Lee asks Barbara a question for you. Thank you, this was really interesting. I'm interested in the dual aspect of natality, that is, natality is giving birth and natality is being born, and how they relate to one another. I wonder if you think the ethical imperatives you describe are necessarily anchored to natality 1, so giving birth as it were, giving birth or mothering, or whether they could be anchored in natality 2, arising from attending to our natal condition as beings who are born. Being born might also imply relationality, vulnerability, care, but maybe less forcefully. What do you think? This is a question for Barbara.
So she wants to know about the ethics part here. Yes, what can I say? Natalities for me is foundational, might be foundational for me. It's foundation for ethics. Yes. The fact that someone is born, it's singular, is irreplaceable, and it becomes it demands an ethical response, and motherhood becomes a living enactment of ethics. So recognizing the other as utterly new, unrepeatable, dependent, yet it's worthy of care and narration as well. So I believe we have the relationality is there in any case. I don't know if it makes sense. You are in the relation, you are the relation, you are for the relation. I don't know, is that clear? It's so, because natality is not simply the fact of birth, but is the ethical condition being born into the worlds of other. So both of them are relationing. So natality is a lived relational event for me, and that is marked by vulnerability, care, and exposure. Both the maternal act of giving birth, but also the fact that you are being as born in interdependence. So you are there in, there is a recognition of uniqueness. So I would say something that is unique rather than autonomous, because you are unique. And so maternal experience, is both grounds for narrative, relational ethics, and not just theoretical abstraction. I don't know if I have answered.
Yeah, I think so. And Lois also wanted to ask here the other speakers whether saying here this general question about different possible ways of understanding the relationship between being born and giving birth and thinking about natality came up in interesting ways in the other presentations. Other panel speakers might also be interested in speaking to this. So I open this question to all the panel speakers. Here is Louis' question of how giving birth and being born as two aspects of natality relate to one another.
Just some thoughts on that in relation to like what I also talked about. I'm interested in the radical new beginning that birth is. That's one perspective, and here I think that natality as giving birth and being born is very intertwined, also very physically intertwined, that you can't really separate those two completely. That the reason why like birth is the beginning of a new life for the newborn, but also a new beginning, a radical new beginning for the one giving birth. And I think those two are just like closely related or like reinforcing each other. So that's one perspective on it from my point of view.
Great, thank you. I have another question here. This question is for Sarah. By Stella Villamea is the question. She says to you, Sarah, thank you for a neat presentation of the possibilities of a comparison of Ricoeur and Arendt on birth. Congrats on bringing Ricoeur's reflections on birth and narrativity back to our minds and fieldwork. Now my question, would you consider analyzing birth testimonies about giving birth through Ricoeur's approach to narrativity? I do think this is a great path of research and contribution. I would be very happy if you eventually engage in such kind of research project.
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, I definitely think that would be a very, very interesting approach to take. There'd be so many interesting factors to consider: agency, temporality, and I think it also connects, with what Hannah, what you were mentioning about this appearance of novelty through birth and how it just really disrupts and brings something radically new into our experiences. So that side of it, and then also, the sort of cultural ideas that surround birth, how contextual things influence our experience and our expectations of birth, and looking at how that interacts with this completely new, unexpected experience could be really, really interesting. And then, of course, drawing in the personal and the embodied and the traumas that can come from the birth experience would be really fascinating to explore from a Ricoeurian perspective. So yeah, thank you for that suggestion. I will definitely look into that further.
Okay, the next question was for me. It's also by Stella. And she says here, wonderful that your background in analytic philosophy of language leads you to explore new types of social ontologies. Because I'm very supportive of this direction, I want to ask, can you expand a bit on what you said, that the wish to live forever denies meaning? And alternative question related to the same, do you think fear of death is related to our ways of giving meaning? And do you think fear of birth or of giving birth with its risk of bringing about death is also related to our ways of giving meaning? Wonderful question. Thank you very much. I feel I need to reflect on it a little bit more. I think I can say something about how the wish to live forever denies meaning, because I think, well, you couldn't live forever. You couldn't live forever because life is itself defined as something that begins, proceeds in a way, has aspects in this process, and then ends. So it would be something else. It would be something you do forever, but it couldn't be living. And because I have this idea that meaning depends on, so we could say that having meaning is really necessary for the flourishing of ourselves. So eudaimonia definitely depends on meaning. and meaning depends on being handed over all the time, of being anew. So in this way, I think that this fear of death and focus on death is actually an error. Death is not death in the sense is not a fearful negative thing. It is something that facilitates this creation of, so it is together with the being born, and in this sense making something positive. And on the other aspect, I think I have to reflect some more. Stella has another question for Hannah. Hannah, Stella asks here, Kierkegaard is such a powerful richness in these topics. Thank you for also bringing him to the field. In connection with Kierkegaard's potential, I was thinking, a baby coming out of a mouth, not just from a vagina, is for me also a metaphor of the fact that the birthing woman not only gives birth, but also gives meaning, how she does not only bear a child, but also bears language, about the fact that she can convey meaning, new words and new meaningful words about the experience of anxiety, abyss, leap, edge, beginning, something, and many others. Given this, what do you think someone who has given birth can add to Kierkegaard's description of anxiety? So my question for you is not about how Kierkegaard's view of anxiety explains what happens at birth, but about how the experience of giving birth adds to Kierkegaard's understanding of anxiety.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's really also something that I'm very interested in now. I'm also working with both that way around in like informing Kierkegaard's thinking and also as a critical element to his thinking. And I would say that I'm very much reading with and against Kierkegaard, because I think that it was you, Beatrice, that also talked about, you mentioned something about like this whole, okay, because when Kierkegaard was talking about anxiety or the leap, he's also talking about this moment of becoming as a first leap, and that is not, that the first leap for Kierkegaard is not birth, or the first moment of becoming is not birth, but later in life when we become conscious of our own freedom. So in that way, I think there's also a correction to Kierkegaard, because I think he has a kind of a natality structure in talking about a first leap and then the many leaps in life. So a first moment of becoming and then the many moments of becoming in life, but he doesn't place that beginning from birth like Arendt would, and I think that that is something that the experience of birth could correct in his thinking. Just to mention like one element. I think there's more also, but that was just one perspective on it.
Thank you. That was great. I have a question myself for Barbara, if I may. There is so far no more question. I believe maybe no more in the Q&A. So I think I might give a question, be able to ask my question. And so, Barbara, I really like this, how you bring in the intergenerational, because it is about identity, relational identity extending across time. And this is also really interesting to me, because I think it also has to extend towards an open future. Can you say something about that, how that plays into your thoughts?
Yes, I mentioned briefly sustainability there, right? So yeah, so probably that's a good question. Yes, maybe the answer is very much, I don't know, it's not really that particular, is that we are all connected. We are all, you know, we pass on everything. We pass on our fears, our love, we pass on everything consciously and subconsciously. So that's why the ethics of interrelationship is very important. And so our action are not just present, our futures and past at the same time. Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to something more complex, but that's what I think. And we are never present being. We are future and past. I mean, I have apart from the part of mitochondria that comes from my mother's, coming from, generational mothers, but I am my mother. My egg was in my mother, and my mother was in my granny womb. No, this is just biological and the mitochondria yeah. So, I mean, we are in I, so we are unique. We are in I, but we are not just that. We forget that. I mean, we always forget I. Forget it's important that we know as women that we have an I, but we are not just that.
Great, thank you for the answer. I think we have no more open questions right now. I want to invite or ask the other panelists: do they have questions? Do they want to have concluding remarks? We have a few more minutes. Anything to conclude here? Okay, if not, I think we had we had vindicated philosophy a little bit today in a good way for the project of natality and birth. I think I have to say that we did well, and I'm happy we were able to do it. Thank you, Anna, and I'm handing it back to you.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. And that was a really incredible panel. I mean, these papers are just so innovative, and they work together. This is being recorded, so I'm so happy that other people will be able to access this information. Okay, so let's see here. We will take a break, and session 9 begins in 15 minutes. All right, so thank you again. And Beatrice, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thanks. Welcome, everybody. We are here. I'm Dr. Anna Hennessy, for those who have just arrived. I'm the founder and the director of the Society for the Study of Pregnancy and Birth. And we are in our last session, session 9. We've had such an incredible ride these past few days with all these beautiful papers coming from so many different areas. So we're going to move right into session 9. I see that I think all of our presenters are here now. And we have our wonderful moderator, Martina Hynan from the University of Galway. This session is titled Placentas, Colostrum, Premature Birth, Rebirth, and Story, Locating Natality Across Traditions. And so, Martina, are you there?
Yes, I am, Anna. How are you?
Thank you so much, Martina. It's great to see you. And thank you for moderating this. All right, so I'm handing this one off to you.
Thank you so much. What an absolute pleasure. And just to add my heartfelt thanks for the last 3 days. It's been phenomenal. I'm already looking forward to watching everybody's presentation again and imagining a book. So I'll just launch right into session 9. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this session and really looking forward to the papers. So the first person, we're doing it in order, and just to reiterate what we've, for all sessions, we will have the 4 presentations and then the Q&A. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A as we go along, and any comments in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. So our first speaker today is Marjolaine Olay from Radboud University, and apologies for the pronunciation of your name. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And the title of their paper is From Mummification to Ecology, the Placenta's Ways of Creating Place, Time, and Community. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you. Well, but we'll move on to the second presenter today, and that is Alexandra Lembke-Ross from the University of Lund. And the title of their paper is From the Midwife to a Gladiator, Natality in the Passion of Perpetua and Felicity. So if you'd like to take over to you, Alexandra.
Hello, and thank you to Martina for the introduction. My name is Alexandra. Today my talk will be expanding on my master's thesis that I wrote at the University of Lund. And I found out a few days ago that I'm going to continue studying the maternal body this autumn in a Marie Curie doctoral fellowship at the University of Bamberg. So exciting things to come. I'm also in my 3rd trimester of pregnancy, so these things are on my mind in more ways than one. I'll just share my screen now. Please let me know if there's any issues with that. Okay. So 2 women stand at the center of the arena, one with swollen breasts, dripping with milk, and a belly softened by recent childbirth. The beasts are impatient, and the crowd is frenzied. Both have a taste for blood. Everything stills and quiets when the spectators look upon these 2 bodies and notice that they are mothers. A shudder ripples through the audience. At the climax of the passion of Perpetua and Felicity, the maternal body stands at the center of the gladiatorial arena and the narrative arc. The attention of the spectators and of us as readers is fixed upon the maternal body. But part of the story, this part, in fact, is not narrated by Perpetua, but by an editor who wrote her the epilogue to her diary sometime afterwards. Perpetua's diary is said to have been written around the year 202 or 203 AD. It is one of the very few voices of a mother that has survived from antiquity. The diary is her account of life in prison and whilst she's on trial, as she awaits her death in the gladiatorial arena. Perpetua wrote about the stress of trying to care for her child while she was imprisoned. She writes about difficulties in trying to arrange for their custody. She writes about her fears around suffering from mastitis when she is forced to abruptly stop breastfeeding. She complains that the prison is hot and crowded, and that she has never known such darkness. But when she finally gets permission for her baby to stay with her, she feels that the prison has become a palace. Perpetua's maternal body is central to the text: breastfeeding, weaning, caring, and dreaming. She, in fact, records her mystical visions as dreams in her diary. The maternal body also pervades the figurative language of the text. Her diary is a tapestry of maternal imagery. Metaphors and similes and allegories are all braided over each other and tie Perpetua's performance of Christian martyrdom closely to her maternal body. So Perpetua's diary comes down to us in the form of manuscripts that were written a long while after her death. And these manuscripts, as I outline on the slide here, come in 4 parts. We have a prologue and an epilogue that have us form a kind of framing narrative around her story. That the prologue introduces her as a Roman noblewoman, and the epilogue details her death in the arena alongside an enslaved woman named Felicity, who has recently given birth. What I think is interesting is that we find the editor describes the maternal body in very different terms to Perpetua herself. They soften her edges and smooth over her acts of resistance. Therefore, I argue that the prison diary of Perpetua, the prologue, and the epilogue should be read as separate texts. Here I take my cue from the historian Kate Cooper. I also identify the distinct tensions between the framing narrative and the prison diary, and then I consider these different voices with different commitments. I think this is especially evident in that Perpetua and the editor express different views of the maternal body, and thus a very different understanding of natality. So why is this important? When I first read Perpetua's diary, I was surprised to learn that for millennia, Perpetua's story was read as a repudiation of motherhood in favor of the holier path, that of the Virgin Martyr. I believe that this binary between the Virgin Martyr and the mother is best summarized by the theologian Carrie Friedrich Frost, who writes that writers of the early church were invested in their defense of virginity as the superior mode of Christian life. As one consequence of this way of thinking, consecrated virginity was valorized at the expense of family life, including motherhood, which led to a negative view of the human body and sexuality, particularly the maternal body. I think that a matricentric reading of Perpetua's diary, one that foregrounds her own understanding of her body, might help us unstitch this negative view of the human body and sexuality that remains embedded in our culture today. To demonstrate this, I would like to zoom in on just one image in the text, and that is Colostrum, to compare how it is seen and understood by Perpetua herself and the editor in the epilogue. So we will begin our reading here in what I think is the most metaphorically fertile of the text passages, which is the first of Perpetua's dreams. Perpetua writes of her vision of an idyllic pastoral scene, as we can see written here, where she comes across a shepherd milking a goat, who then offers her a mouthful of cheese. This dream has layers and images of new life and paradise, the Eucharist and baptism. And in the context in which Perpetua writes, which was 3rd century Roman Carthage, readers could have maybe passed through these layers of metaphor to recognize the passage as both intrinsically Christian and intrinsically maternal. Baptism at the time was closely tied to images of the maternal body and conception. Just as new life is created in the womb, it was understood that a neophyte received new life through Mother Church and the font of her womb. However, there's little to suggest the maternal body in this passage, at least for a modern reader. But in an ancient understanding of gynecology, the word cheese here takes on new significance. The translation of the word cheese has stumped translators over time. In fact, many prefer to translate cassio in the Latin simply to mean milk, as it makes more sense in the context because it's freshly milked from the goat. But Elizabeth Klein, in her analysis, makes a strong argument for sticking with the more literal translation to cheese, as it has important metaphorical connotations within late antiquity. For instance, in writing on the generation of animals, Aristotle articulates a peculiar understanding of conception. In the biological understanding of the time, a baby was conceived by semen coagulating the blood of the womb. Thereby, it was thought the addition of semen would solidify the blood in the womb, and from this mass, a baby was conceived. The coagulation of milk into cheese became an allegory for this process. For the milk to solidify into cheese, it has to be rennet needs to be added to the milk. And when they mixed, they created something new, cheese. So Aristotle thus uses cheese as a metaphor for the process of conception. Klein points to other, especially Christian authors, who take up this image as a metaphor for the creation of new life, and thus baptism. To expand on Klein's thesis, I think it's also interesting to consider this passage in the light of ancient medical authors' writings, particularly Soranus, when they write on colostrum. As a breastfeeding mother, Perpetua's preoccupation with feeding and then weaning her child is woven through the text. The use of the word cheese in this passage could be reflective of this. Soranus describes colostrum as being thick and very cheesy. The confusion that translators have faced when confronted with this passage might be resolved by considering colostrum rather than milk as the substance that the shepherd offers to Perpetua. This would be in keeping with both the breastfeeding motif that is laced throughout the text and a contextual understanding of the interconnectedness of baptism, new life, and the maternal body. This is in contrast to the epilogue. Here we can contrast Perpetua's view of colostrum with that of the editor. The editor writes that in the opening scene that I opened this talk with, that the crowd shuddered, seeing that one of the women was a delicate young girl and the other had recently given birth, as her breast was still dripping with milk. So in the editor's telling, Perpetua's maternity is completely erased. Instead, she is described as a young girl, while Felicity's maternal body is portrayed as an object of shock and repulsion. In their analysis of the scene, the historians Stavroula Constantinou, Naspasias Kouroumoni, Stavrinou emphasize the fact that as Felicity has so recently given birth, the milk dripping from her breast is best understood as colostrum. When we read intertextually with Soranus, this further adds to the sense of revulsion that pervades the passage. Soranus strongly warns his readers against feeding newborns colostrum. We can see that in his quote here from Gynecology. He instead advocates for the use of a wet nurse. He explains his physiological and moral reasoning for this, writing, maternal milk is in most cases bad, thick, very cheesy, hard to digest, raw, and not mature. This takes on a more moral element where he talks about it being produced by bodies in a bad state, agitated, and changed to the extent that we see the body altered after the delivery, which has suffered a great discharge of blood, is dried up, toneless, discolored, and feverish. Rather than an image of new life, Soranus portrays colostrum as a substance of contamination and danger. Constantinou and Kouroumoni Stavrinou highlight the fact that in Soranus's view, the evilness is determined by two factors, its texture and its producer. The state of the mother is reflective in the quality of her milk. Milk and uterine blood were intimately connected in an ancient understanding of the maternal body. Thus, the view that Soranus expresses here, and that was widespread in late antiquity, sees the first milk as contaminated and polluted by lochia, which is the vaginal discharge of blood and uterine tissue that follows birth. By examining the image of colostrum in the text, it becomes evident that whilst Perpetua's ideas of maternity were intimately connected to her spirituality and to her martyrdom, the editor instead reflects a view of the maternal body as polluted and dangerous. In Perpetua's telling, she becomes a martyr through, rather than despite, her maternal body. In the narrator's view, or the editor's view, the maternal body is instead a hindrance to, rather than a locus of the women's martyrdom. This is reflective of the aesthetic ideal of the virgin martyr that was valorized within early Christian writing and theology. Through this lens, the way that Perpetua uses the image of colostrum in her writing speaks to a self-defined view of mothering and its role in her martyrdom. We can see this view of, I think here the terminology from matricentric theory is really important in seeing mothering as a self-defined act and motherhood as an institution that is patriarchally defined. We can see a reflection of this on the other, for instance, in the way the editor reflects a more patriarchal view of both colostrum and motherhood, and sees it as something that stands between the two women and their fate as martyrs. This provides further evidence that Perpetua and her editor had different motivations for writing her story. It is also evidence that Perpetua herself and the editor who wrote her epilogue had different views of natality that expressed within their respective texts. And it highlights the need to read the text separately and at times in contrast to one another, as one of the very few records of an ancient woman's voice that has remained with us from late antiquity. It is especially important that we as scholars separate Perpetua's writing from that of her editor to truly listen to her story as she herself tells it.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was amazing and wonderfully rich. And huge congratulations on your PhD. And I'm very excited for you and looking forward to that on your behalf. So that's wonderful news. So we will now move along to our third speaker. And the third speaker today is Umar Nizaruddin from the University of London. And the title of their paper is Being Too Early in India, Bildungsroman and Belatedness in Premature Birth. So over to you, Umar.
Thank you for inviting me to the conference. So my work is basically on bhakti, which is a dualistic mode of spirituality in India, where the deity is different from the devotee. So there is the permeability of the feminine body of the mother, which is separated from that of the child in bhakti, which is a dualistic philosophy, which is instantiated in figures like Krishna. The emergence of life into an ethnically divided social ecosystem in India brings with it a complex temporality as well as cultural specificity. This would later segue into psychology, infant observation, etc. The scholar Urvashi Agarwal, for instance, says that a girl child that is discriminated against reminds her of her own childhood and makes her identify with the woman she has become. So the strict laws that forbid determination of fetal gender through ultrasound scans or any other means and medical reports on fetus have to be accompanied by the insignia of competent authority that no sort of gender determination test has been carried out so as to prevent female infanticide. The emergence of gender as ethical lottery is commonplace because of this. The stringent laws which are in place to prevent female feticide due to traditional preference for male children in parts of India, excluding Kerala, Meghalaya, where the matrilineal traditions as well as progressive movements have acted as deterrent. The preterm birth of a female child can be linked to a belated Bildungsroman in the Indian context, because the Indian sense of time is cyclical and the tradition of history in India does not follow a written paradigm but rather an orality. When a cyclical sense of time that consists of birth, death, rebirth, and the abyss of metempsychosis through infinite yonis or vaginas in different castes and forms as human and animal, the linear trajectory of the traditional Bildungsroman becomes less relevant. The preterm birth features in literature of feminine trauma. So Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, in her essay Can the Subaltern Speak, speaks of a woman, 16 years old, named Bhuneshwari Bhaduri, who committed suicide because she didn't want to be captured. And she committed suicide while she was menstruating because she wanted to prevent the calumny that she was expecting a child out of wedlock. So in order to prevent the cannot being spread that a young girl in India at that point of time, before 1947, could commit suicide only owing to the shame of having born a child out of wedlock, she decided to take her life while she was menstruating. So the agency of the self, of the permeable feminine body, which is Advaitic, which is monistic, and which at the same time contains a cyclical temporality of trauma, which is inserted into the feminine Bildungsroman of writers, especially Arundhati Roy, an activist and writer from Kerala, who writes about the congealed subjectivity of dizygotic twins Esther and Rahel, in her Booker Prize-winning novel, The God of Small Things, set in the backdrop of caste atrocities and the emergence of a nascent communist movement in Kerala, India. Ammu, the mother, had her birth pangs while the children were on a bus, while they were on a bus in northeast of India, where her husband was working as an estate supervisor. The solicitousness and concern of the passengers in the bus is evoked by Roy that they exhibited the sympathy of the abjectly poor for the relatively well-off. The children pride themselves on their near bus berth and rue the missed opportunity of a lifetime of free bus rides. They were nearly born on a bus, Esther and Rahel, the car in which Baba, their father, was taking Ammu, their mother, to hospital in Shillong, Meghalaya, to have them, broke down on the winding tea estate road in Assam. They abandoned the car and flagged down a crowded state transport bus with the clear compassion of the very poor for the comparatively well-off, or perhaps only because they saw how hugely pregnant Ammu was. Seated passengers made room for the couple, and for the rest of the journey, Esther and Rahel's father had to hold the mother's stomach with them in it to prevent it from wobbling. That was before they were divorced and Ammu came back to live in Kerala. According to Esther, if they had been born on the bus, they would have got free bus rides for the rest of their lives. It wasn't clear where he had got his information from or how he knew these things, but for years the twins harbored a faint resentment against their parents for having diddled them out of a lifetime of free bus rides. They also believed that if they were killed on a zebra crossing, the government would pay for the funerals. The novel revolves around the twins and the mother Ammu, who is divorced and has come to stay in their homestead, where she has no rights and her brother Chaku dominates the household. Ammu has an affair with a childhood friend, a so-called lower caste person called Veluta, which, when discovered by her Syrian Christian family, upper caste, is not tolerated. Only the twins survive to retell the story in multiple registers. The novel relates the coalesced selves, the Advaitic nature of the twins Rahel and Esther, who evoke their selves collectively as I and individually as we in a confusion of pronouns. Rahel had come to see her brother Esther. There were two egg twins, dizygotic, doctors call them, born from separate but simultaneously fertilized eggs. Esteban was the older by 18 minutes. They never did look much like each other, Esther and Rahel, and even when they were thin-armed children, flat-chested, worm-ridden, and Elvis Presley puffed, there was none of the usual who is who and which is which from our smiling relatives or the Syrian Orthodox bishops who frequently visited the Imanam house for donations. The confusion lay in a deeper, more secret place. In those early amorphous years when memory had only just begun, when life was full of beginnings and no ends, and everything was forever, Esteban and Rahel thought of themselves together as me and separately, individually as we or us, as though they were a rare breed of Siamese twins, physically separate but with joined identities. Rahel has a memory of waking up one night giggling at Esther's funny dream. She has other memories too that she has no right to have. She remembers what the orange drink, lemon drink man did to Esther in Ablestokis. So these are only the small things. Anyway, now she thinks of Esther and Rahel as them because separately the two of them are no longer what they were or ever thought they would be, ever. And Ammu, because she has an affair with Velita, is forced to get rid of Esther, the boy, and this is compared to Mose and the Pharaoh story, and also Karna, a hero in the legend Mahabharata, who is abandoned after childbirth by his mother Kunti because she had conceived Karna with the son before she was married, and fearing calumny, like Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, she floats the child on the Ganges. And later, the child would be picked up by a charioteer and bring the child as his own. And later there would be a war called the Kurukshetra and the Bhagavad Gita, where Karna would fight his brothers. And so essentially the story also is mirrored in God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, where Esther is abandoned by his mother Amu, and the same story is also presented as a Kathakali, an Indic performance dance form from Kerala. So the Advaitic monastic current of the Vedic corpus of India can be seen to have best out the twin identity crisis with a stamp of approval for the Syrian Christian community, which belongs to the Eastern Church that has withstood the early modern incursions and evangelical missions of colonial nature. Advaita, as a major monastic current that uprooted Buddhism in India, was propounded by Shankaracharya from Kerala. The thou art that principle of Advaitic monism as well as Sufism have informed the anti-caste movement in Kerala, spearheaded by various spiritual leaders like Sri Narayana Guru. The multi-genesis ideology of caste is pitted against Advaita, and there is a monogenesis ideology which has become what is called the Kerala Enlightenment, Kerala modernity, and one of the earliest democratically elected communist governments. So, the idea of Krishna, the infant Krishna, who has a devotee in Puntanam Nambudiri, who himself had a child, and during the naming ceremony, Chorunu ceremony of the child, various people come to visit the family, and all of them are wearing an upper clothes on their torsos, a kind of towel. And all of them, after entering the house, remove the towel from their torsos and unknowingly, accidentally place these towels on top of the crib where the baby is sleeping. And as a result, the baby suffocates and dies. And so Punthanam, who is a devotee of Krishna, he writes the poem, when the infant Krishna is dancing in your mind, what need do I have for other babies of my own? So this is also uncannily similar to the Freudian metaphor of the father whose son visits in a dream visitation and says, Vater, kannst du sie das ich verbrennen? So the insanity among Syrian Christians is the praise they paid for inbreeding, according to the character Chaco. So Roy says that equally it could be argued that it all began thousands of years ago, long before the Marxists came, before the British took Malabar, before the Dutch ascendancy, before Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut, before the Zamorin's conquest of Calicut, before three purple-robed Syrian bishops murdered by the Portuguese were found floating in the sea with coiled sea serpents riding on their chests and oysters knotted in their tangled beards. It could be argued that it began long before. In an amniotic metaphor, Christianity arrived in a boat and seeped into Kerala like bleeding tea from a tea bag. That it really began in the days when the love laws were made, the laws that laid down who should be loved and how much. The idea of the Intik Vasudeva Kudumbakam, the world as a family that accepts various ethnicities and races as its own, is foregrounded by Roy, for whom the circle of violence and counter-violence can potentially be stemmed by identifying with this maternal Cora of census communists called the Cora by Julia Kristeva, the prehistoric, non-archived tradition of existence and acceptance of birth, rebirth, and the eternal reiteration of life in a trajectory towards moksha, an elusive soteriology that is sought ab ovo. So this is why Beno, etc., have called Roy's narrative atemporal and negative and dark. Thus, the past is always in the present, and the present is always shaping the future. This fluid backwards and forwards movement of the chronological, of the Cora, of the cyclical Cora temporal sequences are no longer anchored in a static time frame, and the temporal signifiers float loosely on a stream of sliding signifiers as the reader gropes her way through the narrative's cyclical labyrinthine structure rather than a linear progression. So, following Gill and Idjar, motherhood not solely as reproduction of the species and family, but of an entire series of social functions, which could also include caste, which is the major Advaitic current which divides society into four classes based on the origin of different yonis, of different births. The Brahmin, the Kshatriya, the Shudra, and the Vaishya, which are essentially based on vocations but became congealed and lapidary later based on birth, where a priest would be a Brahmin, and a fighter would be a Kshatriya, and a merchant would be a Vaishya, and a peasant would be Shudra. So, Roy, a vehement critique of the caste atrocities, gave this speech where she calls for a broader identification with the egalitarian traditions of Vasudeva Kutumbaka, the world as the family of Krishna. Is it really possible for people who suffered so cruelly, more cruelly perhaps than any other people, to understand the vulnerability and yearning of those whom they have displaced? Does extreme suffering always kindle cruelty? What hope does this leave the human race with? What will happen to a people in the event of a victory? When a nation without a state eventually proclaims a state, what kind of state will it be? What horrors will be perpetrated under its flag? Is it a separate state that we should be fighting for, or the rights to life, of liberty and dignity for everyone, regardless of their caste, ethnicity, religion, or nation? So for newborns, I conclude here, it's an unbalanced fight for life. We have to put 4 or 5 babies in one incubator. Most of them don't survive, says Dr. Al-Shayer at the Al-Hilal Maternity Hospital. Thank you.
Thank you, Umar. That was staggering. Thank you. Oh, yes, you can hear me. Sorry, I thought for a second I hadn't got my audio on. Thank you so much. So we are moving to our last presenter now. And just to remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A or comments in the chat. And if you have any recommendations or sources or anything that come to mind, feel free to share that. But please do put your questions in the Q&A and we'll gather them up at the end. So our fourth speaker this afternoon is Caitlin Solomini, from the Postpartum Production Podcast. She is the Postpartum Production Podcast host, I should say. And the title of Caitlin's paper today is Listening to Voices of Postpartum Experiences. So I'll hand over to you, Caitlin.
Thank you, Martina, and thank you all of my fellow panelists. I've learned so much today, and thank you to Anna Hennessy also for this incredible symposium and all the organizers. I am not presently a working academic, despite 2 master's degrees, but I am a published novelist and writer. And just as a little bit of background, over 3 years ago, after the birth of my 3rd child, I was just sort of very overtaken by this question of whether or not I was alone in feeling creatively inspired by birth and early postpartum as an artist and as a writer. I decided to begin podcast conversations with other artists in postpartum and in the postpartum journey. And this latest season, season 3, has focused on the intersection of birth, rebirth, and creativity. And so with that in mind, for the presentation today, it's a little bit unconventional, but I'm going to share an audio compilation of voices. So I wanted the contributors and the guests on the podcast to be able to speak for themselves. And I think it will speak to a lot of the topics of the symposium as a whole in today's presentation. So hopefully, let me make sure this works because sometimes the audio sharing can be share sound. Okay, I think I can get this done. Hold on one second. Okay, so that is my podcast page. And I am going to share this. And it's about 16 minutes of compiled audio from this latest season.
This is the only time in my life where I've been so forced to think about what's going on inside of my body. And I kind of wish we were always thinking about that. But I think in pregnancy and postpartum, you're so much more aware because there's an actual being that was inside, and then it's outside, and that feeling of emptiness even is so striking. So I think that's what a lot of the work was about very soon after giving birth. A lot of reflections of the sensations of pregnancy, but also the sensations thereafter.
The giving birth, though, I don't think it ends. I think it's a continual thing. Things will continually be created, throughout one's life as one continues to grow.
And even just the language that a person would choose to use about their birth gives you such a window into who has influenced you. Like, what were your options? What did your mom talk to you about birth? Like, there's just so many layers that, yeah, just like you said, are so fascinating that I want to hear from everybody. Because I feel like, writers are good at finding the narrative things within our lives. Like, that's obviously our life's work. We work really hard to learn how to do that. But so many people give birth, and it's this narrative experience that is available to every birthing person of, this is a thing that happened to me that was huge.
There's always that feeling of like, when is the right time to have a baby? And I don't think that there is in probably any profession, but this feels like one where it's very common to feel like afraid to do it because you're going to set yourself back or like remove yourself from the conversation, and anything you can do to like not do that is so beneficial. And for me, that's been creating my own things. But I've in the past had moments of resentment against that idea where it's like, you have to be doing all your own stuff if you want anything to happen, because it's not true for everyone. But I do feel like it's more and more the case in this field.
But adding context, and particularly for poets of color and then poets of color who are women, we're left out of the archive often. So, you're just creating context for these lives and people that had extraordinary incidences happen in their lives, but also, that raised us. So that to me was like the work of the thing.
So I think I've become a lot more productive with my time. And also, this is fiction, so nothing in here actually happened, but it all like kind of happened. I do write about myself. I don't imagine very well. So kids are just like an endless supply of things to write about. And so many conversations with little kids that aren't metaphors as they're happening can easily be a metaphor when you start writing about it. And then also, it's very interesting to see the ways that friends parent and how our friendships have changed, or choices they're making or choices I'm making. So that kind of stuff, it changes relationships in such an interesting way that this book it's really interested in those kinds of changes that all have to do with having a kid.
Purpose can be seen in very different ways and pursued in very different ways. As much as I love dance, it's one of the biggest things that I will always have in my life. Bringing a human being to Earth, it's so magical. You are designing life, you are educating life, you are teaching them the do's and don'ts of life. But I think also having the experience of almost losing what you love, but finding a different purpose in it, it can shift everything.
So this is called Ode to Estrogen. Estrogen, your lissome slink and feral howl, your honeycomb of mad impulse. I carefully peel back the adhesive, apply the translucent moon to my upper thigh. Neruda was 20 when he wrote his 20 love songs and a song of despair. 20, the age, give or take, of my ex-husband's new fiancé. Everyone loves estrogen, the midwife assures me, writing a prescription. When Neruda writes, the light wraps you in its mortal flame. When he writes, you look like a world lying in surrender. What he means is, I love you, estrogen. Before he broke up with me last week, the Turkish mathematician told me the tide of our passion had ebbed. Estrogen, see ire, see oxygen. The midwife promised no side effects, but the swell of my sobs beat against his seawall. how we clash like Greek gods, with great force and without dignity. The estrogen flows directly into my bloodstream, a gadfly sent by Hera to torment Io. When Neruda writes, "Quién eres tú? ¿Quién eres?" O estrogen, wrap me in your mortal flame a little longer.
But this was like a lack of control that I completely was at peace with and invited, because I knew, you know, in the end what it was doing. And it was just so amazing. I mean, there's definitely a horror movie element to all of this, like all of the blood, all of these crazy contractions, these crazy convulsions definitely reminded me of different horror movies and of the monstrous feminine, which is this thing that's really been a preoccupation of mine in my work, and equating the feminine and the monstrous and how that can be this major sign of strength and reclamation of female agency.
Once I got past the initial shock, then I felt like I found this new courage, this new kind of force that I didn't know I had, because I think everything that had been told to me about the birth experience was how much it was going to hurt me and how much it was going to possibly injure or kill me, that I would be lucky to get out of it unscathed. I think that was like the vibe I had going into birth. And then actually in the birth of my older daughter, which was a very fast, very dramatic and intense natural birth, I remember looking into my husband's eyes and seeing pure fear, like awe and fear and like, whoa, and feeling like that is the correct response. And that is a place where I've stayed for a long time. Like, that is what I'm capable of, this awesome power. That sounds crazy to say out loud, but that is how I felt. The creative process for me is an attempt to do what my body did in pregnancy with the part of me in my head. And then the part of me that's my body, because that's also on stage. But when your brain can take a quote, a movement, a piece of music, an idea, a feeling, and put them together and they turn into something, that is magical.
I mean, I think every time we sit down at the blank page, it's a type of birth, right? I mean, we're pulling something into existence that wasn't there before. So there's definitely that piece. And then taking these individual poems or these individual pieces of poems and pulling them together to create this larger whole is a whole other type of birth and creation. And sort of similar to parenting young people and giving birth to young people, it also doesn't stop there, right? It's like the poems and the book, they go out into the world and then they suddenly have this life of their own, much like our young people will as they transition into the world themselves.
I was exhausted. I had 2 kids, a 2-year-old and a baby. They were with me pretty much all the time. I was very tired, but I still felt this spark of creativity, excitement, and energy that I can't really explain, other than to say that it was directly related to them and to being a mother, and then infused itself with my intellectual interests.
What that meant was I then had the equipment necessary to honestly like have the gall to look at birth not only as what did it mean to me or what does it mean to my friend, but to think about it as a site from which to ask questions of who has power, what do these changes over time or these practices reveal about relative power or value, or whose kinds of knowledge is considered legible and real and whose isn't, and what do the ways that we use technology, for instance, demonstrate about that.
Midlife crises are funny. I don't feel I had a midlife crisis. I feel I had a midlife rebirth where I just decided the most fun, amazing, exciting thing that I can do right now is go to medical school. It's in my heart. I feel like I get to be a new person. I get to live 2 lives. I have lived as an artist And now I will have lived as a doctor. So I have given birth to an entirely new person. And I just think it's fun. I get to experience life twice. And I think that's what a midlife reimagining and revisioning should be all about.
I just felt really on fire creatively and intellectually. Despite all the sleep deprivation, I felt a really strong desire to understand what was going on, because at times I was finding it so difficult that I needed to work out for my own psychological survival whether that made me a bad mum, or there was something fundamentally wrong with me, that I wasn't enjoying every minute, or that I couldn't seem to feed well, or I couldn't soothe my very colicky child, or the feeling rules, to use Arlie Hochschild's term. Then the norms around maternal subjectivity felt incredibly trapping and oppressive. So there was an element of survival to writing it. And how did I write it? I mean, I think that I was obsessed with the subject. A lot of that, I think, was fueled with a kind of cold rage of feeling that the institution of motherhood in so many ways was taking advantage of women around me across race and class lines and socioeconomic lines, and in so many different areas, in terms of maternity care, in terms of going back to work, all sorts of, there's so many structures in the institution which need improvement. So it was almost not an option for this not to be a subject. So I think about giving birth and natality as something that we can all do every day, like a power of natality that we have, which is never ending, and that it's possible every day to give birth to something new. And what have I given birth to? I don't know. I mean, yes, the books and the babies, but I spend a lot of time outside, and I feel that natality and giving birth is a condition of being alive. Every time we breathe, we are giving birth to some kind of microorganisms. And I suppose that philosophically or intellectually, that's exciting to me, because I don't believe that the structures and systems that we live in today are natural, or we take them as a given that it has to be like this. And I don't believe that's true. And I think when I look out and I look at the natality of the world, it's empowering, and it shows how things can change and new things can be birthed. I just have a strong belief in that. New movements, new ways of being, new ways of thinking, and new language is so much part of that.
And in terms of care, I think we're not really talking about how transformative care can be if a person is supported, if they have the space to do that, that's actually a really powerful and transformative experience for men and for women. And that's not to say people should do that and necessarily it will always be like that, but it can be like that. And God knows we need more of that energy and that learning than we need people going out and making more spreadsheet models stuff. That kind of learning that's really deep and personal and intimate and nuanced, that's really valuable. And instead we just try and turn it into, well, how can we make this the most cost effective and provide a higher level of care, but just institutionalize it and whatnot. It's threatening to talk about it as something that is really personal and intimate, because does that mean that you should then quit your job and go do that? Not necessarily, but how can you fold that awareness into it, that it can be this really powerful thing, not only for the child, but for the caregiver themselves and for our understanding of what matters in community and in society, all of that. And for living in community, which I think all of us want a lot more of, and we're not getting when we're isolating all of these things in their own institution, where you go to work and your kid is over here and everything is in its little silo. We're missing that too.
I don't want it to be that because I had this unmedicated home birth, that wasn't my goal. My goal was to feel supported and to feel empowered. And so how she was born and all of it didn't it did matter. Obviously, I wanted her to be healthy, but what specific journey that took mattered less to me. I knew I had done the work. I had the knowledge. I had done the body work. I had done the spiritual work. I did all of that so that I just felt okay. I didn't feel scared. I just felt like I knew that everyone around me was there and would support me. But I guess what I'm saying is that the point for me isn't how the baby's born. It isn't like hospital, home, vaginal, non, but it's how you feel through that. And honestly, really, who's with you? And I think that that's a part of the cultural narrative that we've totally lost. Each child is so different and so unique that the things that you think you can do, whether it comes to birth or parenting with one, the same rules do not apply. And so unlearning and relearning and all of that, I felt like was a really positive thing for me individually, just as a human, because I think had I had only the first, for whatever reason, it was a fairly easy process for me with understanding who she was, whereas this felt different. And so I think it was a necessary humbling, I guess, in terms of just teaching me that, no, I really don't know what I'm doing, and that's okay. The more that we share birth stories, the more that we feel connected to these lineages that are so deeply ancestral and powerful, and that we all have that within us, no matter what that particular birth process or outcome looks like. But the most important thing is to really feel truly supported and truly powerful.
Okay. Okay. So that concludes that part of the presentation. And I just wanted to add a little addendum to that, which is that you may have heard our own Anna Hennessy's voice, if you recognized it in there. She was a guest this season. And you heard from an incredible range of artists and mothers who are poets and dancers and actresses, musicians, the whole gamut. So I thank you for listening, and would love to also feature anyone's voices here that are interested in future seasons. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, for that. That was, I feel we should take a moment. There were so many voices coming. It was absolutely incredible. All of the presentations have been amazing. So what I'm going to do is go to the Q&A, and so I'll do that now. And I noticed that Stella had asked Marjolaine, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, a question, and you had answered it. But just to point out that, as far as I'm aware, the attendees can't see the Q&A. So what I'd like to do is to read out the question, and then I can read the answer, or you might like to answer the question live if you want. Marjolaine, what do you think? I'll read it first while you're thinking about that. So thank you so much for your interest in the so forgotten placenta. Would you like to comment on a hypothesis or description of the placenta as the twin, double, inner, outer soul of the pregnant woman, rather than the twin of the one who is to be born? Would this hypothesis description offer another entrance into the move from mummification to ecology? Would you like to answer that? I know you kind of
yes.
have. But...
Yes, well, thank you for reading the question. I think it's a really interesting question. I'll just say a few more things about the question, and I'm curious whether Stella has any specific references for this. As far as I've seen, at least in ancient Rome and in ancient Egypt, there aren't references to this kind of doubling of the female pregnant woman. But it's an interesting question, because I think still that my answer would be similar, namely that I wouldn't want to, even though there would be a bit more of a feminist streak to this, kind of focusing upon the woman, I still would want to make an argumentative plea for thinking about the broader aspects of what makes pregnancy possible. So really kind of emphasizing, as some of the more recent archaeologists do, kind of emphasizing the importance that the Egyptians had on the landscape, on the Nile, on nutrition, on kind of all these other broader aspects of pregnancy and how it connects to the broader ecological world. So I would still want to make my broader argument. But I do think this would be an interesting kind of twist and kind of would emphasize other aspects of pregnancy. So I was fascinated by this question. Thank you.
folks. Yeah, so there was a second question here, which I noticed that you also answered in the Q&A, but just for attendees who couldn't see or can't see the Q&A. So again, I'll read it. This is from Florence. And so thank you for this fascinating paper. Can you offer further comments on what the Egyptologists reading Egypt through the lens of African context, thought of actual real twin births? Are there any depictions of twins in this Egyptian context or texts about actual twin birth that were ever more rare than today? There is a variety of attitudes towards twins, actual twins, not the child plus placenta, considering them as a blessing or a curse. What about twins that share the same placenta? Fascinating.
Yeah, it's also a really interesting question, and one that kind of I did earlier find, but I had to kind of think through the various sources based on Florence's question, and it's really interesting because there's been a lot of emphasis within this ancient Egyptian context on this placental double, which is really kind of emphasized in the scholarship, but also is represented quite frequently on the paintings and on the carvings. But actually, by the few sources that I have found that describe these actual twins are rather negative about it. Either when it's an identical twin, it's seen as a dangerous case of hyperfertility, or when it's non-identical twins, there is this supposition in some of the texts that this highlights different fathers that could be involved in this pregnancy. So there's actually kind of this notion of something evil that's or something sinful, if you want to talk about it in those terms, that's happening in the pregnancy. So it's rather negative. And there's one other source that talks about it as well, which I'll look into. But most of the sources that I know talk about these actual twins as being negative. The one about sharing the same placenta, I haven't found any sources on this, but I find it intriguing. But as they're doing more and more research, sort of scanning mummies, there's also kind of more sources on twin births. And also their practice of sometimes burying those different, if they were born dead, of burying them along with a mother. So I'm curious what's percolating and if any kind of other insights will come from that. But it's really interesting how the actual practice of twins is very different from the symbolic representation of the twins as the placental twin. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I think there are a couple of more questions here. This is for Umar. This is from Antoni Bacelli. So thank you for your enlightening presentation. These stories are incredible, but also reflecting of our societies. At some point, the presence of pregnant woman unites people across classes. Do you think that birth and motherhood needs to gain a much bigger role of righting the wrongs in our current societal drive to forms of extreme individualism? So that is for Umar, if you'd like to comment on that.
Thank you for that question, because the sense of individuation in a society that is fragmented presents certain challenges. Because on the one hand, you are trying to overcome the fragmentation of society, and on the other hand, you trying to get over the self-incurred tutelage of humanity and enable people to think for themselves. So how can these twin agendas be made possible as part of some kind of reform that poses a double bind? So in the epic Mahabharata also, when Kunti, the mother Kunti, she abandons her child, and later in life she comes and reveals that she is the mother, and at the same time she requests the child that you should not fight your brother Arjuna, who's the great warrior, the Achilles figure. So this means that Karna can only die. So it presents him with a double bind, the maternal double bind. Either he has to, he is his mother's son, she acknowledges it. At the same time, she is asking him for his life. So how can at the same time one overcome the fragmentation and at the same time enable individuation and feminine agency, where a woman can say no to preterm pregnant, to underage marriage, or a marriage that she doesn't like, or dowry wedding, or molestation, which is not possible in certain contexts where women don't have that agency, that presents a double bind. Thank you.
Thank you, Umar. I have another question for you. This is from Anna Hennessy, and she asks, could you speak more about why it is that matrilineal traditions persists in regions like Kerala? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's very interesting because it has a long history. So there are various hypotheses based on this. None of this can be final. So the essential argument is that trading communities, essentially because the trading men would be far away from their homesteads for long periods of time. So the women had to be alone in their homesteads. So the women would take care of the homesteads. So instead of the father, the paternal figure, the matriarch, like an anthill, like a termite nest, the matriarch would be in charge of the household, and the uncle, rather than the father, would be the central figure. So much so that people would even take the surnames of their uncles rather than the names of their on fathers, and also in a certain way to ensure the lineage, because once a person's sister conceives and she has a child, so they can rest assured that the child is his nephew. But it was not always clear in a patriarchal society whether a child belonged to a man. Because, a famous writer, N.S. Madhavan, she makes the comment, the father is more precious because the father is a recent invention, but we always had the mother. So that persists, that confusion, the origin, that confusion persists. Thank you.
Thank you, Marla. Wonderful. So I have a question here. This is for Alexandra. It's from Agnes Howard. And Agnes asks, thank you for this paper and congratulations, first of all. So you show that misunderstanding of colostrum enabled misunderstanding how martyrdom and motherhood might fit together. Since martyrdom is a way to bear witness with the body, what else do you think Perpetua what else do you think Perpetua be bearing witness to through display of her motherhood for her more immediate audiences or now? Okay.
Thank you so much for the question, Agnes. And yeah, I think it's a very interesting one. Martina, can I ask you to repeat just the final part, because I want to make sure I get it right?
Yeah, sure. I'll read it. So it said, since martyrdom is a way to bear witness with the body, what else do you think Perpetua, I think it is bearing witness to, through display of her motherhood for her more immediate audiences or now?
I think it's really interesting to think of it both in terms of her more immediate audiences and now, because I think one of the most interesting parts of Perpetua's story, and it's interesting how it links to her name, is that she's writing for a future audience. She knows that she's going to die. So she's writing both for an immediate audience of her current context, maybe other people who are converting to Christianity and in the specifics, and so that her martyrdom is a witness to that and to her faith, and perhaps like narratively a form of persuasion in that way. But I think you can also hear in the narrative voice a writing to posterity more generally, and I think she takes strength from her faith in her and her visions in her writing. And I think she hopes that future people reading the text will also find strength in those visions. So I think the reflection between what she's writing about that's happening physically for her, literally for her in her body, and then the more figurative, mystical, imaginative aspects are linked together in that bearing witness for both the more literal conversion of people in Roman North Carthage, but then also as a source of strength for Christians in what ends up being millennia to come. So I hope that addresses the question, but it's a really interesting one that I'm going to continue thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll be coming back to you. We have another question, but I'll give you a moment because we've. Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute myself. So from Argelim, we've another question. This is from Sophie Wagner. So she just comments really that to Margelim, in Germany, the lost twin is a big issue in therapy. An actual twin that died, it is always a longing for symbiosis. Is it always a longing for symbiosis? Just, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting kind of question. And I do think, and that's, I think, some of the strengths of Sloterdijk's kind of analysis of trying to think about these placental doubles, either by how they've kind of figuratively have been represented as guardian angels or as protective geniuses. What he wants to argue is that, yeah, there is a sense of kind of symbiosis, but there's also kind of this notion that there is a unique other who knows you in a particular kind of way and protects you. And he calls that kind of the augmenter, like the one who mediates and the one who catalyzes your existence. So in his understanding, at least, right, there's more than symbiosis going on. There's actually kind of this notion of a specific device of someone who's devoted to you and really supplements your existence. And in modern culture, at least his argument is that we find it in different kind of role models fulfilled. But for instance, right, our sleeping with pillows and our kind of holding on to supportive devices are ways in which we kind of seek modes in which our existence becomes augmented through another, in that case, kind of an artificial thing. So I would want to say that the current kind of obsession with kind of these lost twins is interesting, because I think it's not so much only a notion of symbiosis, but also kind of this romantic lookout that we may have for thinking that there is someone who uniquely knows us in a way that others could never do so, and thereby there's also kind of this romanticism going on that's there. And in my studies of trying to grasp pregnancy on this broader ecological level, what I found upon, and I know that Anna has mentioned this as well in some research, is this notion of microchimerism, which is this phenomenon where we as children, but also as ones who have carried pregnancies, either so-called with a result of a baby or with miscarrying or through abortion, we carry fragments of genetic populations of cells within us, also of our own mothers, of possible other children that our mothers conceived of. So I find that actually far more interesting insofar as not wanting to think about this unique doubling, but thinking about ourselves as being consisting of multiple populations that reside in our bodies. And that would very much contest this notion of just one unique other supplementing us, but us being the product of these genetic populations. And what's super interesting about microchimerism is also that those cells can be housed in our bodies and can actually become active in the way of facilitating certain diseases or protecting us against diseases. So there is an actual living physiological, but also possible pathological pattern of living multiple genetic communities. And so again, I understand the preoccupation, but my counter argument would be kind of to focus on those broader populations within which we live. So that would be my answer. But I thank you for the question. Super interesting. Thank you.
It's fascinating. And just to add that I came across microchimerism in my own research, and again, reflecting on it, I was thinking I'm the seventh child, so I was imagining traces of my siblings are in there and all of that as well. And so I just found that really, really fascinating way to think about, as you say, these multiplicities that we live in and with, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So I have a question for Caitlin. And this one, I'm just going to go up a little on my little screen here. So this is from Anna, for you, Caitlin, from Anna Hennessy. So she asks, so thank you for providing us with all these rich voices related to birth and birth stories. Do you have any thoughts Sorry. Do you have any thoughts on how birth as a rite of passage is not actually complete when the birth process ends, but that the telling of the birth story in a social context is also an important part of the completion process?
Thank you, Anna. I don't know if I will have a complete answer for you. Someone who sat with a number of artists this season and hearing their birth stories. What struck me was thinking about the competing structures of power, and I think that came up a lot in the voices, and also politics overlaying the maternal body. And so thinking about the site of the retelling, of the temporal aspects of when that is, right, of when and where and to whom it's being told and how it shifts. So I think in that sense, the story itself also can morph over time. And you had me thinking, one of the guests that I spoke to, her name's Rachel Summerstein, and her book, Invisible Labor, the untold story of the C-section, she obviously unpacks a lot of those kinds of questions. And then also obviously Lucy Jones and Matrescence and her, in the clip that was shared in this compilation, obviously about rebirth and natality in terms of the natural world and what we see. So I was thinking also a lot about really that kind of intersection of the birth story's life outside of the birthing person themselves as well. And it's been really beautiful, and for those interested in the podcast, to see those representations in, you know, a lot of the guests in their art, in their dance, in their poetry, and how it again has a new reconfiguration in an artistic format is also really inspiring and interesting too.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and Anna's just put in the chat the link to her most recent article, which is about microchimerism as well, which it's a wonderful read. And I did pick up on Lucy Jones' voice in the clips as well. And I was thinking about in my own work, I mentioned holobiont. The holobiont is a compilation of symbiosis. So sort of the evolutionary developmental biologist Scott Gilbert says that, you know, birth is a continuation of the holobiont community, and I think that that works beautifully with microchimerism. A beautiful kind of connection there. So yes, we have a question now for Alexandra. Back to you, Alexandra. And this is from Stella. And actually, yes, so she, okay, so there's two comments. I'm going to read the comment first and then the question, Stella. I hope that makes sense. So Stella says, I should have started by saying how much precision there was in your talk. Thank you for bringing truth to Perpetua's words, Perpetua meaning everlasting or eternal. What an irony for her life, and yet what a continuing reach and significance. Thank you. And then her question, this is from Stella too. She comments, cheese is a way to preserve milk, to make it last longer. I was wondering whether you would like to use this idea to continue building on your interpretation and application of how the editor of the epilogue read Perpetua's words.
Oh, that's so interesting. I've been thinking a lot about cheese, as you can hear in the talk, but I hadn't thought about that as a process of conservation. That's really interesting to think about, the connection between conception and conservation, conserving something. So that is a brand new idea to me, but one that I'm going to think about. I wonder how that could be. Yes, I think that could be really interesting and something I'm going to ponder. So thank you so much, Stella, for bringing that up. And I think it's fascinating to me how just this one word, cheese, that in the first translation I ever read, it was just milk, so I never picked up on it. And then in the second translation I read, it was cheese, and just that one little anomaly has been really fruitful in so many different ideas. So I'm interested to go down this path now too.
Wonderful. And I have a comment here, and this is for Caitlin. This is from Lois Lee. So thank you all, such moving presentations. And for Caitlin, It was wonderful to hear all those voices. Thank you. I'm struck listening to them by the framing of your podcast and talk around the postpartum. And I wanted to ask your reflections on these conversations, on how postpartum subjectivities maybe change over time. Lucy Jones' idea of matrescence lays emphasis on postpartum as a sort of fixed state after we give birth. We are changed forever. We can't go back. At the same time, the wonderful clip you shared here from Lucy gave such a sense of a changing experience of postpartum. She began this project obsessed with cold rage, and today thinks about natality as never-ending power. I guess you have talked with women at different stages of postpartum experience and wondered if you had any reflections on, I don't know, how experience of natality might take on different forms over time. And then she comments, I'm sure I could have put that more briefly. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you, Lois. You said pretty much everything that I couldn't say, so thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that, honestly, I like to let my guests speak to these questions, and I tend to be someone who's just asking questions rather than answering them. So being asked questions today even feels a little bit uncomfortable for me. But I think that one thing that has come up quite frequently, almost in every single interview, has been the fact that the postpartum shift, and obviously this idea of matrescence and this identity that changes over time when one has this experience of shifting into a caregiving role, continues to sort of be a framework through which I think so many of these artists are reevaluating themselves and their work, as well as the wider world. So I feel like it's interesting in that, as you heard one of the guests, Athena Reich, was the one who was speaking about midlife and rebirth. And she is actually her artistic tradition is one where she is a Lady Gaga impersonator. And she has this incredible, I wish she was still doing this. I had come across her work in San Francisco. She had this art birth performance as Lady Gaga giving birth on stage. So you can just imagine how incredible that could be. And to hear her speak through all of that work that she had done and then come to this moment in life where she has been literally reinventing herself in terms of going back to medical school. So I think the resonance is so individual, but also so communal, right, at the same time. So I think there's different ways in which it feels like the guests are wrestling with how that how that framework in terms of their own kind of rebirth through the process of postpartum is impacting them, but then also looking outside of them at outside of their own individual experiences at how that framework could potentially be applied, whether that is socially, politically, artistically. And so that's been really interesting for me to witness in their interviews and also in their work. So yeah, thank you for asking.
Thank you so much. Have you come across Marnie Kotak, the artist who I just brought it up on my phone while you were talking? She did a performance, when was it? I don't know, a long time ago, 2011. And it was a month-long performance, an installation culminating in the birth of her first child at a gallery. So it was live streamed. And I just thought you might be interested. I'll put the link in the chat.
Please do. Please do.
It's just
Thank you.
interesting. It just came to my mind. Let me just check if there's any more questions. That's such an interesting answer. So Lois just says, thank you, Caitlin. That's such an interesting answer. I think we're pretty much up on questions. So, I mean, I was wondering if any of the presenters have questions for each other, or if you have anything you'd like to comment on at this point. And I'm just going to be checking that I haven't missed anything. But if you have questions for each other or thoughts that you'd like to share at this point. I was thinking about the previous session about how so much of the philosophy, the discussion was around making meaning. And I kept thinking that with the emphasis in this session around tradition, and I kept thinking about we're remaking meaning and we're rethinking the traditions that you all discussed with such clarity and amazing observations around placenta, colostrum, and everything, and the lived experience as well. So I'm just, so if are there any further questions? I'm just checking from anybody. No, I don't see any more. Have I missed anything? No. So I'm just trying to think then we might sort of draw to a conclusion. We literally are on time, would you believe? We're coming up to 8 o'clock. I can't believe it. That flew by. So I just want to thank you all for an amazing session. I'll be thinking about everything that came up today. And I'm looking forward to watching back all of these amazing presentations when they're available. And I'm going to abuse my position as moderator to thank Anna again for this phenomenal symposium, and absolutely really want to extend heartfelt thanks to everybody who presented and asked questions. I've just learned so much and I've enjoyed every minute of it. And thank you all for today's session as well. It was wonderful.
I am Dr. Anna Arendt. I am the founder and director of the Society for the Study of Pregnancy and Birth, and I've prepared a few very short remarks. It will not take 15 minutes. So good afternoon, everyone. Over the past 3 days, we have witnessed the coming together of scholars across such vast fields as the arts, humanities, healthcare, midwifery studies, philosophy, psychology, and social sciences. In our 9 sessions, we discussed so many important topics related to birth, natality, rebirth, coming into being, pre and perinatal care, mothering, and midwifery, as well as mortality and its relationship to natality. My own prefrontal cortex feels richer and larger after these 3 days, and I am excited and intrigued by what I heard, as well as through some of the images that were presented. During these sessions, new interdisciplinary connections were made, and I expect that some of these will bear new fruit in the study of pregnancy and birth. We thank all of our moderators for their help in working with participants and addressing questions from our attendees, and we are grateful for our technical staff in the help they provided during the event. I especially thank all of our participants. It was the vast range of participant interest and creativity that allowed us to develop a unique and beautiful program for the Society's 2025 Symposium. We are now beginning to look forward to new events in 2026 and will make initial announcements about our future symposium or speaker opportunities through our newsletter. If you are not already receiving the newsletter, you can sign up through the link listed on this page that I have on the screen, or you can email us at the address listed there. As we prepare for next year's events, I'm also looking for funding to help with the costs of organizing the event. This year, I mainly funded the event myself after our primary source of funding fell through. Funds help with technical support, use of the platform, and time organizing the symposium. If you or your institution is interested in collaborating for next year, please let me know. Also, if anyone would like to volunteer as a moderator or to help with future events outside of funding, that would also be much appreciated. Feel free to check out our website for events listings or access our publications page, which already includes a vast bibliography of material related to pregnancy, birth, and mothering. There has actually been amazing works written over the past few decades, quite a few works, I must say. But many don't know about these works, and they haven't been talked about in the academic sphere. If you have recently published work of your own or know of other important work related to these topics that is not currently listed on our publication page, let us know through email, and we will add these publications to our page as soon as we can. I maintain the bibliography myself and will be returning to it now that the symposium is over. And actually, I have received a few emails with lists that I need to add. So it's not totally up to date at this time. We are all living through a bizarre and rather troubling historical moment together, but I feel a deep sense of gratitude for this community of ideas, natality, and a love of humanity that we have shared in over the past few days. Thank you, and I look forward to being in touch with you again in the near future. So I thank you again, and with those closing remarks, I close our 2025 symposium. Thank you so much, and take care.